Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Picture this. It's midnight on the Sunset Strip, and the neon signs paint the pavement in electric pink and acid green. A line snakes around the block at the Whisky A Go-Go, where tomorrow's rock legends are playing to a crowd of teenage runaways, trust fund kids, and genuine music lovers all pressed together in the darkness. The air smells like patchouli oil mixed with exhaust fumes, and somewhere in the distance police sirens wail their lonely song through the Los Angeles night. This is 1970s Los Angeles, a city balanced on the edge of a dream. Now shift forward 12 hours. The same street looks completely different under the harsh morning sun. Businessmen in wide collared shirts and flared trousers hurry toward glass office buildings, clutching briefcases and coffee cups. Secretaries in midi skirts and platform shoes click along the sidewalk. The glamour has evaporated with the darkness, revealing a working city, an industrial city, a city where people chase paychecks just as desperately as they chase fame. This is also 1970s Los Angeles, and both versions are equally true. The 1970s in Los Angeles weren't just a decade, they were a transformation, a cultural earthquake that reshaped American entertainment, music, and lifestyle. This was the moment when Hollywood stopped being a factory and became an art form, when the Sunset Strip evolved from a gangster playground into a rock and roll cathedral, when a sprawling collection of suburbs and neighborhoods somehow cohered into the world's entertainment capital, a title it holds to this day. But here's what they don't tell you in the glossy retrospectives and nostalgic documentaries. 1970s Los Angeles was complicated, beautiful and ugly, optimistic and paranoid, creative and corrupt. It was a city where you could stumble onto Joni Mitchell writing songs in Laurel Canyon one afternoon, then read about a gruesome murder in the Hollywood Hills the next morning. It was a place where fortunes were made on cocaine deals and movie contracts, sometimes in the same conversation. It was freedom and fear, sunshine and shadow, all mixed together under that relentless California sky. Tonight, we're going to walk through that vanished world together. We'll cruise down Van Nuys Boulevard on a Wednesday night, when the entire teenage population of the San Fernando Valley turned the street into a moving party. We'll slip past the velvet ropes at the Rainbow Bar and Grill when John Lennon and Alice Cooper were holding court at their regular tables. We'll feel the ground shake during punk shows in dingy clubs, where a new generation rejected everything their hippie older siblings believed in. We'll understand why people formed cults in the canyons, why crime exploded in certain neighborhoods while others remained pristine, and how a city rebuilt itself after the shock of the Manson murders. This is the story they don't tell, the complete picture, the reality behind the myth. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let me take you back to a time when Los Angeles was young and dangerous and impossibly alive, when anything seemed possible and frequently was, when the city was writing the script for modern American culture without quite realizing what it was doing. Let's begin at the beginning, on the first day of the decade that would change everything. January 1st, 1970 dawned clear and cool over Los Angeles. People woke up with hangovers, both literal and metaphorical. The parties from the night before had been loud and long, but there was something subdued about the celebration, something tentative. The 60s were over, and everyone seemed to understand that something had ended, though nobody could quite articulate what would come next. In the canyons and hills above Los Angeles, in the winding roads where movie stars and musicians had built their dream houses, people were still nervous. They checked their locks more carefully now. They looked at strangers with suspicion, because just 4 months earlier, on August 9th, 1969, members of the Manson family had entered a house on Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon and committed murders so brutal, so senseless, that the entire city's sense of safety had shattered like dropped glass. Sharon Tate had been 8.5 months pregnant. She was an actress, beautiful and kind by all accounts, married to film director Roman Polanski. The others killed that night were Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, Wojciech Frykowski, Folger's boyfriend, and Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old kid who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next night, the killers struck again, murdering supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary in Los Feliz. The murders weren't solved until December 1969, but by January 1970, everyone knew the story. Charles Manson, a failed musician with messianic delusions, had convinced a group of young followers to commit murder as part of his twisted vision of an apocalyptic race war he called Helter Skelter. The trial was ongoing, and it would drag on for months, keeping the horror fresh in everyone's mind. What made it worse was that the killers weren't monsters from some distant place. They were young people, mostly women in their early 20s, who had been part of the hippie counterculture. They'd lived at Spahn Ranch, an old movie set in the hills, sharing drugs and free love and commune living. They were what hippies were supposed to be, right up until the moment they became murderers. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. If these flower children could transform into killers, what did that say about the entire countercultural movement? What did it say about the idealism of the 60s? For many people in Los Angeles, the Manson murders marked a clear dividing line. The 60s had been about opening up, trusting strangers, inviting people into your life and your home. The 70s would be about locking doors, installing security systems, and wondering if that friendly hitchhiker might be dangerous. Paranoia, which had been a joke or a drug side effect, became a reasonable response to the world. But life continued, because it always does. People still had to go to work, raise children, pay mortgages. Los Angeles in 1970 was still fundamentally a prosperous city. The aerospace industry was booming, with companies like Lockheed, Northrop, and McDonnell Douglas employing hundreds of thousands of people designing aircraft and missiles and satellites. The Cold War was excellent for business, and Southern California was where much of that business happened. Neighborhoods sprawled outward in every direction. Where orange groves had stood just a few years earlier, now there were tract homes with two-car garages and swimming pools. Homes where young families were living the California dream. The San Fernando Valley, which had been largely agricultural in the 1950s, was now almost completely developed. Drive down any street and you'd see the same scene repeated endlessly. Ranch-style houses painted in muted earth tones. Lawns kept green despite the desert climate. American-made cars in the driveways. The cost of living was reasonable by today's standards, though locals at the time complained about rising prices. A nice 3-bedroom house in a good neighborhood might cost $30,000. A gallon of gas was 36 cents. A dozen eggs cost 60 cents. A new Chevrolet Impala, one of the most popular cars of the era, had a sticker price around $3,500. The median household income was under $10,000 a year, but that was enough for a comfortable middle-class existence. The architecture of Los Angeles in 1970 reflected decades of growth and changing styles. In older neighborhoods like Hancock Park and Los Feliz, you'd find grand houses from the 20s and 30s, Spanish colonial revival mansions and English Tudor fantasies, built when Hollywood money was new and flashy. Downtown still had Art Deco office buildings from the golden age of Los Angeles. Beautiful towers with ornate details that were starting to look dated next to the newer glass and steel structures going up. Mid-century modern architecture was everywhere in the residential areas. Those flat-roofed, glass-walled houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine, and often did, were the aspirational style of the time. Architects like Richard Neutra and John Lautner had designed homes that seemed to float in the hillsides, all clean lines and open spaces, houses where the boundary between indoors and outdoors dissolved. But for all the beauty and prosperity, Los Angeles in 1970 was also dealing with serious environmental problems. The smog was legendary and genuinely dangerous. On bad days, the air would be brown and thick, stinging your eyes and throat. Children couldn't play outside during smog alerts. The pollution was so severe that it became a national embarrassment, a symbol of what unchecked industrial growth could do to the environment. The smog came from multiple sources. Car exhaust was the biggest culprit in a city where everyone drove everywhere. Industrial facilities pumped pollutants into the air. Even backyard incinerators, which many homeowners used to burn their trash, contributed to the problem. The mountains that ringed the Los Angeles basin trapped the pollution like a bowl, letting it concentrate and intensify. People were starting to fight back. The first Earth Day would happen in April 1970, and environmental activism was growing. California was passing some of the nation's first serious air quality regulations. Catalytic converters would be mandated for new cars by 1975. But in 1970, breathing in Los Angeles meant inhaling a chemical cocktail, and everyone just accepted it as the price of living in paradise. Water was the other great environmental challenge, as it always had been in Southern California. Los Angeles is essentially a desert that humans forced to bloom through massive water importation projects. The Los Angeles Aqueduct brought water from the Owens Valley, hundreds of miles to the north. The Colorado River Aqueduct brought more water from the east. Without these engineering marvels, Los Angeles as we know it couldn't exist. The city sprawled across valleys and over hills, connected by an ever-expanding freeway system. The freeways were newer then, less congested than they would later become. You could actually drive from downtown to the beach in half an hour during off-peak times, something that would become impossible within a few years. The freeway system was still being built out. The Century Freeway wouldn't be completed until the 1990s. The Glenn Anderson Freeway was still mostly on drawing boards. Neighborhoods had distinct characters. Beverly Hills was old money and movie stars, pristine and protected. Watts was predominantly black and still recovering from the devastating riots of 1965, when decades of police brutality and economic marginalization had exploded into 5 days of burning and looting. South Central was working-class black and Latino families trying to get by. Chinatown and Little Tokyo maintained their ethnic identities despite pressure from development. Silver Lake and Echo Park were artistic and slightly bohemian, places where rents were still cheap enough for musicians and painters to survive. Laurel Canyon, winding through the Hollywood Hills, had become famous as the home of the singer-songwriter movement. Joni Mitchell lived there. Crosby, Stills and Nash had harmonized for the first time at Mitchell's house in July 1969. The canyon was full of musicians, all living in close proximity, trading ideas and collaborating, and occasionally sleeping, together, creating a scene that would define a particular sound, a particular moment. Venice Beach was its own weird world, a place where bodybuilders pumped iron at Muscle Beach, artists painted murals on building walls, and countercultural types sold handmade jewelry to tourists. The canals that gave Venice its name were deteriorating, filled with stagnant water, but the neighborhood had a scruffy charm that attracted creative people who couldn't afford anything more conventional. Malibu was expensive and exclusive, a string of beach houses where the wealthy could escape the city. The Pacific Coast Highway wound along the coast, offering stunning ocean views and access to beaches that ranged from crowded and noisy to isolated and pristine. Surfing culture was huge in Malibu and throughout the beach communities, a lifestyle built around waves and wetsuits, and a certain mellow attitude toward life. The San Fernando Valley was suburban family territory. Tract homes stretched from North Hollywood to Northridge, from Van Nuys to Woodland Hills. This was where middle-class families raised their kids, where shopping malls anchored commercial districts, where high schools dominated teenage life. The valley had a reputation for being boring compared to the hipper parts of Los Angeles, but it was also more affordable and more stable, which mattered to people trying to provide for their families. As 1970 began, Los Angeles was a city in transition, mourning the loss of 60s innocence while not yet understanding what the 70s would bring. The optimism hadn't completely drained away, but it was becoming more guarded, more realistic. People still believed in the California dream, that idea that you could come to Los Angeles and reinvent yourself, become successful, live in the sunshine. But they were learning that dreams come with shadows attached. The city was about to enter its most creatively fertile and culturally influential period. Movies, music, and television produced in Los Angeles during the 1970s would reshape American popular culture, but none of that was obvious yet. In January 1970, people were just trying to recover from the shock of the previous year, trying to figure out how to move forward, trying to find hope in a moment that felt heavy with darkness. The morning after the 60s was uncertain and strange, but morning had arrived whether anyone was ready or not. Los Angeles would face the new decade the way it had always faced challenges, with a mixture of ambition, creativity, denial, and stubborn optimism. The city specialized in reinvention. It would reinvent itself again now, becoming something nobody could quite predict, something that would define an era. Morning in Los Angeles began with radio. Before alarm clocks could play recorded music, before phones could wake you with customized tones, people relied on clock radios that automatically turned on at a set time. The voices and music coming through the speaker were your first connection to the world outside your bedroom. KMET was the rock station, playing album cuts and deep tracks, employing DJs who talked about music like it mattered because it did. KRTH played oldies, which in 1970 meant music from the 1950s and early 1960s. KFI was news and talk. KROQ was still years away from becoming the influential alternative station it would later be. In 1970, it played a more conventional format, though it was starting to experiment with new wave and punk as the decade progressed. Television options were limited. If you had a good antenna, you could pick up maybe 4 or 5 channels: ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS if you were lucky, and perhaps one independent station showing old movies and reruns. That was it. No cable, no streaming, no hundreds of channels. Everyone watched the same shows because everyone had the same limited options. People read newspapers. The Los Angeles Times arrived on doorsteps every morning, a thick package of news, sports, business, and entertainment. In the afternoons, the Herald Examiner provided a second daily dose of information. Reading the paper was how you learned what had happened in the world, how you followed ongoing stories, how you found out what movies were playing or what was on sale at the local department store. Fashion in 1970s Los Angeles was gloriously varied and frequently ridiculous by modern standards. Early in the decade, hippie influences were still strong. Bell-bottom jeans were ubiquitous, flaring out from the knee to cover your shoes, sometimes dragging on the ground and fraying at the hem. Men and women both wore them, paired with peasant blouses, tie-dyed shirts, or fitted tops that emphasized the contrast between tight upper body and voluminous lower body. Earth tones dominated the color palette: browns, oranges, harvest golds, avocado greens. These colors appeared everywhere, in clothing and home decor and car interiors. Looking at photographs from the era, everything seems to be bathed in warm, autumnal light, as if the entire decade happened in October. Platform shoes were a phenomenon that needs to be experienced to be believed. The soles were several inches thick, sometimes 5 or 6 inches, elevating the wearer to improbable heights. Men and women both wore platforms, making entire crowds of people taller than they actually were. The shoes came in every imaginable material: leather, suede, vinyl in metallic colors, clear acrylic with flowers or goldfish trapped inside. Walking in platforms required practice and balance, and emergency room visits from ankle injuries were common. Women's fashion evolved rapidly through the decade. Miniskirts from the 60s coexisted with midi and maxi lengths. Hot pants, essentially very short shorts, were briefly everywhere, paired with knee-high boots and fitted tops. Jumpsuits became popular, one-piece garments that zipped up the front, making bathroom visits complicated but looking undeniably cool. Halter tops exposed backs and shoulders. Tube tops stayed up through faith and friction. As the decade progressed, disco fashion emerged for evening wear. Satin shirts unbuttoned to expose chest hair and gold chains. Tight pants that left little to the imagination. Dresses covered in sequins that caught the light on dance floors. The goal was to shine, to be noticed, to look expensive even if you weren't. Men's fashion was equally adventurous. Shirts had wide collars, sometimes extending nearly to the shoulders. Patterns were bold. Paisley, floral, geometric designs in clashing colours. Turtlenecks were popular, layered under sport coats. Leisure suits, those matching jacket and trouser combinations in polyester, became a symbol of the era. They came in every colour, and men wore them to work, to parties, on dates, believing they looked sophisticated and modern. Hair was a major commitment. For women, Farrah Fawcett's feathered style became iconic in the mid-70s, requiring careful blow-drying to achieve those wings that flipped away from the face. Long, straight hair parted in the middle was also popular, the Cher look that required hours of ironing to remove any natural wave or curl. Perms added volume and curl for those who wanted a different texture. Men's hair got longer through the early 70s, touching collars and even shoulders. a rebellious statement that gradually became mainstream. Sideburns extended down toward jawlines. Moustaches were common, sometimes paired with beards. The afro worn by black men and women was a powerful symbol of black pride and natural beauty, a rejection of white beauty standards that had dominated for so long. The workplace in 1970s Los Angeles operated under rules that would be unthinkable today. Smoking was permitted everywhere, in offices, in restaurants, on airplanes, in hospital waiting rooms. Non-smokers just had to accept living in a haze of cigarette smoke. Ashtrays sat on every desk. Gender dynamics in the workplace were blatantly unequal. Women were secretaries, teachers, nurses, rarely managers or executives. Sexual harassment wasn't even a term people used. Bosses made comments about female employees' appearance and asked them to fetch coffee. Want ads in newspapers were divided into help wanted male and help wanted female, with the better jobs listed in the male section. The women's liberation movement was challenging these inequalities, but change came slowly. Working mothers were viewed with suspicion. Childcare wasn't widely available, and many employers wouldn't hire women of childbearing age, assuming they'd quit to have babies. Credit cards were often issued only to husbands, with wives as authorized users. Women needed their husband's permission to get certain loans or make major purchases. Racial discrimination in employment was technically illegal after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but practice lagged far behind law. Industries and neighborhoods remained largely segregated. Many companies had unspoken quotas limiting minority hiring. Glass ceilings weren't just a metaphor, they were thick, concrete barriers. Shopping in 1970s Los Angeles meant going to department stores and shopping malls. Robinsons, the Broadway, Bullock's and May Company anchored commercial districts. These weren't just stores, they were experiences. You'd dress up to go shopping. Salespeople worked on commission and paid attention to customers. Fitting rooms had actual attendants who would bring you different sizes. The shopping mall was a relatively new concept that exploded in the 70s. The Westside Pavilion, Century City Shopping Center, the Beverly Center, which opened in 1982, replacing Beverly Park. These were destinations where you could spend an entire afternoon browsing stores, eating in the food court, maybe catching a movie. Malls were climate-controlled, safe, clean environments where teenagers hung out and families spent weekends. For groceries, you went to supermarkets like Alpha Beta, Lucky, or Safeway. The food selection was less diverse than modern stores. Produce sections were smaller, offering basics like lettuce, tomatoes, potatoes, apples, oranges. Organic wasn't a category most people thought about. Health food stores existed for the granola and sprouts crowd, but mainstream America ate processed food without much concern about additives or preservatives. Car culture defined Los Angeles more than any other American city. Public transportation was minimal, almost useless for most trips. You needed a car to survive. Muscle cars were still popular in the early 70s. Dodge Chargers, Chevrolet Chevelle, Ford Mustangs, powerful vehicles with big engines that guzzled gas without apology. Then came the 1973 oil crisis. Arab nations declared an oil embargo against countries supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, including the United States. Suddenly, gasoline was scarce and expensive. Prices jumped from 36 cents per gallon to over 60 cents, then higher. Gas stations ran out of fuel. Lines formed, cars idling for hours waiting for their turn at the pump. Some stations imposed limits, $10 maximum per customer, or closed alternate days depending on whether your license plate ended in an odd or even number. The crisis changed American car culture. Those gas-guzzling muscle cars suddenly seemed foolish. Smaller, more fuel-efficient imports from Japan became attractive. The Honda Civic, Toyota Corolla, and Datsun B210 offered practical transportation that didn't require a second mortgage to fill the tank. American manufacturers scrambled to produce smaller cars, with varying degrees of success. Driving in Los Angeles meant dealing with smog, traffic that was getting worse each year, and aggressive drivers who treated the freeway like a personal racetrack. But it also meant freedom. Teenagers counted the days until they could get their driver's license because that meant independence, the ability to escape parental supervision, access to the entire city. Cruising was a major social activity. On weekend nights, teenagers would drive main streets in their cars, windows down, radio playing, watching other cars and being watched. Van Nuys Boulevard in the San Fernando Valley became famous for Wednesday night cruising, when thousands of young people would slowly roll down the boulevard, showing off their cars, flirting, sometimes racing when they thought they could get away with it. Food culture in 70s Los Angeles was more limited than today, but evolving. Fast food was exploding as a concept. McDonald's was already huge, but other chains were expanding rapidly. Taco Bell brought approximated Mexican food to the masses. Davina Schnitzel served hot dogs. Carl's Jr. and Jack in the Box competed for the burger dollar. For sit-down dining, steakhouses were popular for special occasions. Places like Laurie's The Prime Rib offered classic American dining. Big cuts of meat, baked potatoes, salad with ranch or blue cheese dressing. Italian restaurants served spaghetti and meatballs, lasagna, pizza with thick crusts. Chinese restaurants offered Americanized versions of Cantonese food. Chop suey, egg foo young, sweet and sour pork. Ethnic cuisine was less accessible than it would become. Sushi was exotic and slightly suspect, raw fish being something most Americans wouldn't consider eating. Thai and Vietnamese restaurants were rare, though that would change as immigration patterns shifted after the Vietnam War. Korean barbecue existed in Koreatown but hadn't crossed over to mainstream popularity. The health food movement was growing, particularly in beach communities and among younger, more countercultural Angelenos. Restaurants served brown rice, steamed vegetables, tofu for the adventurous. Smoothies and juice bars promoted wellness and natural living. Nutritional yeast, wheat germ and carob as a chocolate substitute were staples of health food stores. Children in 1970s Los Angeles had a completely different existence than modern kids. There were no play dates scheduled weeks in advance. Kids just went outside and found other kids to play with. Parents didn't hover or supervise constantly. As long as you came home when the streetlights came on, you had freedom to roam the neighborhood. Summer was endless and unstructured. No camps, no organized activities filling every hour. You rode your bike, played in the street, built forts, had water balloon fights, got bored, and figured out how to entertain yourself. Television was limited to certain hours, and parents controlled the TV anyway, so you couldn't just zone out in front of screens all day. Toys were simpler. Matchbox cars, Barbies, board games, sports equipment. Video games didn't exist until Pong appeared in the mid-70s, and even then it was a novelty available only in pizza parlors and bars. Atari home consoles wouldn't arrive until the late 70s, and they were expensive enough that not every family had one. School was more regimented and formal than today. Teachers commanded respect through authority, not by earning it. Corporal punishment was still permitted in many schools. Paddle spankings in the principal's office were a genuine threat. Detention meant sitting silently in a room after school, copying lines or staring at the wall. Neighborhoods in Los Angeles maintained clear boundaries, often along racial and economic lines. Beverly Hills was wealthy and white, protected by its own police force and municipal government. Bel Air and Brentwood were similar, privileged enclaves where the rich could isolate themselves from urban problems. South Central was predominantly black, home to families who had migrated from the South during and after World War II, seeking better opportunities in California's defense industries. By the 70s, many of those opportunities had evaporated, leaving neighborhoods struggling with poverty, unemployment, and increasing violence. The Watts riots of 1965 had burned through South Central, destroying businesses and infrastructure, and the area never fully recovered. Tension between black residents and the predominantly white Los Angeles Police Department remained high. Every police interaction carried the potential for escalation, for violence, for tragedy. East Los Angeles was heavily Latino, particularly Mexican-American families who had lived in California for generations, alongside more recent immigrants. Boyle Heights, Lincoln Heights, and surrounding neighborhoods had their own culture, their own music, their own identity separate from the Anglo majority. Koreatown was emerging as an ethnic enclave as Korean immigrants arrived in increasing numbers during the 70s. The neighborhood around Olympic Boulevard and Western Avenue was transforming, with Korean businesses replacing older establishments, signs in Hangul appearing alongside English. Chinatown and Little Tokyo had existed for decades, ethnic neighborhoods where Chinese and Japanese residents and business owners created communities within the larger city. These weren't tourist attractions, though tourists certainly visited. They were real neighborhoods where people lived and worked, maintained cultural traditions, and navigated between their ethnic identity and American identity. What children did for entertainment in this pre-digital age seems almost unbelievable now. They played outside until dark. They used their imagination. A cardboard box could be a spaceship, a fort, a car. A stick could be a sword, a wand, a baseball bat. You made up games, established rules, negotiated disputes without adult intervention. Libraries were important. Kids rode their bikes to the public library, got library cards, checked out books, and actually read them. The library was free entertainment, air-conditioned during hot summers, and staffed by librarians who recommended books and enforced quiet. Movie theatres offered weekend matinees, double, features where you could watch 2 movies for the price of 1. The films were often older titles, but kids didn't care. Sitting in a dark theatre with friends, eating popcorn with too much butter, watching adventure or comedy or science fiction was a perfect afternoon. Communication was face-to-face or by phone. Landlines attached to walls with cords long enough to stretch into another room if you needed privacy. Long-distance calls were expensive, charged by the minute, so you kept them short. Calling someone meant hoping they were home, because there was no way to leave a message unless they had an answering machine, which most people didn't. Dating operated according to different rules. Boys asked girls out, usually days in advance, not through text messages, but through phone calls or in-person conversations that required actual courage. You went to movies, to miniature golf, to restaurants, to drive-ins where more making out than movie watching typically occurred. Singles bars existed for adults looking to meet potential partners. Places like the Marina del Rey area had bars where young professionals gathered on weekend nights, hoping to connect with someone attractive. Alcohol lowered inhibitions, disco music provided ambiance, and people actually talked to strangers without the safety of dating apps and carefully curated profiles. Personal ads in newspapers represented another option. People wrote descriptions of themselves and what they sought, publishing them in the classified section, then waited for responses delivered by mail. The process was slow, uncertain, and often disappointing. But for people who struggled with traditional dating, it provided an alternative. This was daily life in 1970s Los Angeles. Analog, slower paced, less convenient than today, but also less overwhelming, less connected, but perhaps more present. People lived in the moment because the moment was all they had. No phones captured every experience, no social media demanded constant performance. Life happened, and then it was over, remembered but not recorded, existing in memory rather than digital storage. The city thrived on this everyday reality, millions of people pursuing their individual dreams and desires, creating a collective energy that made Los Angeles feel alive, dynamic, always on the verge of something new. As afternoon faded into evening, the Sunset Strip began its transformation. The stretch of Sunset Boulevard running through West Hollywood was unincorporated territory, not technically part of Los Angeles, which meant it wasn't subject to the same laws, the same police oversight, the same restrictions that governed the city proper. This legal loophole created a paradise for nightlife, a place where almost anything could happen and frequently did. The Strip had a long history of pushing boundaries. In the 20s and 30s, during Prohibition, speakeasies and illegal gambling dens operated openly, protected by corruption and the ambiguity of jurisdiction. In the 40s and 50s, glamorous nightclubs like Cairo's, the Mocambo, and the Trocadero attracted Hollywood's elite movie stars and moguls drinking expensive champagne and being photographed for the society pages. By the 60s, rock and roll had discovered the Strip. The Whisky A Go-Go opened in 1964, introducing go-go dancing and booking bands that would become legends. The Doors were the house band before they got famous, playing 6 nights a week, developing their sound, and Jim Morrison's shamanic stage presence in front of small crowds who had no idea they were watching history. In the 70s, the Strip was at the absolute peak of its cultural influence. Every night was a festival of music, drugs, sex, and spectacle. The clubs were packed with the most attractive young people in Los Angeles, dressed in their finest glitter and leather, ready to stay out until dawn, ready for anything. The Whisky A Go-Go remained the cornerstone of the scene. Located at 8901 Sunset Boulevard, the club had a distinctive facade and an interior that had witnessed countless legendary performances. When you walked in, you descended into darkness broken by stage lights and the suspended cage, where go-go dancers would perform between sets, a Whisky trademark that became famous worldwide. The booking policy was ambitious. On any given week, you might see established stars testing new material or unknown bands having their breakthrough moment. Van Halen was discovered at the Whisky. Frank Zappa played there. Buffalo Springfield, The Byrds, Love, Janis Joplin with Big Brother and the Holding Company, everyone passed through at some point. The sound system was excellent, the sightlines decent despite the crowded floor. But the Whisky was less about comfort and more about being part of something. The crowd was young, passionate about music, willing to stand for hours because sitting down wasn't really an option. The dress code was whatever made you feel confident, from full glam regalia to simple jeans and t-shirts, though most people leaned toward the theatrical. Just down the street at 9015 Sunset Boulevard sat the Rainbow Bar and Grill, which opened in 1972 and instantly became rock royalty's living room. The downstairs was a restaurant with surprisingly good Italian food. The upstairs was Over the Rainbow, a private club where the truly important people gathered, away from the general public, able to party without interference. The Rainbow's interior was dark wood and leather, illuminated by coloured lights that gave everyone a warm, flattering glow. The walls were decorated with rock and roll memorabilia, gold records and concert posters, creating a sense of history and legitimacy. The bar was long and always crowded, staffed by bartenders who knew what everyone drank and made sure glasses stayed full. The regular crowd at the Rainbow included John Lennon, who spent his lost weekend period in Los Angeles in 1973 and 1974, drinking heavily and carousing with friends like Alice Cooper and Harry Nilsson. The stories from that era are legendary. Destructive behaviour, wild parties, music industry deals made at 3 in the morning over the 10th round of drinks. Ringo Starr was also a regular. Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees, Keith Moon from The Who, who was notorious for trashing hotel rooms and was banned from several establishments, but always welcome at the Rainbow. Led Zeppelin treated the Rainbow like a second home whenever they toured through Los Angeles. The band members would hold court in their preferred booth, surrounded by groupies and hangers-on, ordering bottles of expensive liquor and whatever pharmaceutical enhancements the evening required. The stories involving Led Zeppelin and the Rainbow are too numerous and often too depraved to recount in detail, but suffice to say that excess was not just accepted, but celebrated. The parking lot between the Rainbow and the Roxy Theatre, about 90 feet of prime Sunset Strip real estate, became known as the Rock and Roll Parking Lot. This was where band members, managers, record company executives, groupies, drug dealers, and assorted characters would congregate before and after shows. Deals were made, pills were sold, sexual propositions were offered and accepted, all under the dim streetlights, while traffic crawled past on Sunset Boulevard. The Roxy Theatre at 9009 Sunset Boulevard opened in 1973, created by Lou Adler, the music producer and entrepreneur who had a gift for understanding where culture was heading. The Roxy was smaller and more intimate than many venues, with excellent acoustics and sightlines. The booking policy focused on artists at interesting moments in their careers, legends like Neil Young and Bob Marley, alongside rising stars like Bruce Springsteen and Prince. The Roxy hosted the first American production of the Rocky Horror Show on its stage in 1974, a theatrical run that led directly to the cult classic film. The combination of rock music, sexual ambiguity, audience participation, and campy horror struck a chord with Los Angeles audiences, who packed the theatre night after night. Just across the street at 9039 Sunset Boulevard stood Gazzarri's, a club that had been around since the 60s, but hit its stride in the 70s. Bill Gazzarri, the owner, would dress up like a gangster and prowl the club on performance nights, creating atmosphere and watching over his domain. Gazzarri's was famous for having house bands that would play there for months, even years, developing their craft and building a following before getting signed to record deals. Van Halen was the house band at Gazzarri's from 1974 to 1977, playing 6 nights a week, perfecting their act. Eddie Van Halen was already one of the greatest guitarists alive, though almost nobody knew it yet. David Lee Roth was flamboyant and athletic, doing splits and kicks that foreshadowed the theatrical performances he'd later bring to arenas. They'd play 3 sets a night, mixing cover songs with original material, building the repertoire that would become their debut album. The club also featured go-go dancers between band sets, beautiful young women in revealing outfits who danced on platforms and in cages, providing visual entertainment and helping maintain energy levels. This was standard for many clubs on the Strip. The women were paid, but not much, often hoping to catch the attention of band members or industry people who might offer better opportunities. Rodney Bingenheimer's English Disco opened in 1972 at 7561 Sunset Boulevard, near the eastern end of the Strip. Rodney was a small, slight man with an encyclopedic knowledge of British rock and a gift for spotting trends before anyone else. His club was influenced by glam rock, that theatrical, androgynous style pioneered by David Bowie, Mark Bolan, and Roxy Music. The music was British and cutting edge, the crowd was young and fashionable, and the atmosphere was permissive in ways that would be shocking today. Underage admission was common at Rodney's. As long as you looked cool and weren't obviously 12 years old, you could get in. No ID checks, no legal drinking age enforcement, just trust that everyone would behave reasonably, which of course they didn't. Teenagers mixed with adults, alcohol flowed freely, drugs were consumed openly, and relationships formed that crossed age boundaries in troubling ways. The club became a proving ground for punk and new wave bands later in the decade. The Ramones played there, Blondie performed early shows there, the Runaways, an all-female teenage rock band managed by the controversial Kim Fowley, were regulars. Devo brought their strange, robotic art rock to Rodney's stage. The club captured the shift from glam to punk, from makeup and platform boots to leather and safety pins. The scene at Rodney's was heavily influenced by groupie culture. The term baby groupie emerged to describe teenage girls who attached themselves to older rock musicians, providing sexual services in exchange for proximity to fame. It's uncomfortable to discuss now, understanding as we do that these were children being exploited by adults. But at the time it was presented as liberation, as young women exercising sexual freedom and agency. Some of these girls became famous in their own right. Sable Starr, who called herself Queen of the Groupies, had relationships with Iggy Pop, David Bowie, and members of Led Zeppelin while she was still in her teens. Lori Lightning, who started hanging around Rodney's at age 13, eventually married Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page when she was older. These relationships were known, discussed, even celebrated in certain circles, the harm and exploitation invisible or ignored. The fashion on the Sunset Strip was spectacular and ridiculous and entirely serious to the people wearing it. Glam rock in the early 70s meant platform boots with 5-inch heels, satin pants so tight you couldn't sit down comfortably, shirts open to the navel revealing hairless chests and necklaces, makeup including glitter and eyeliner for men as well as women. David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust persona set the template: alien, androgynous, dangerous, beautiful. Women wore similarly theatrical clothing, hot pants with thigh-high boots, halter tops that barely qualified as clothing, massive amounts of jewellery, hair teased into gravity-defying constructions. The goal was to be noticed, to stand out, to project confidence and sexuality and coolness all at once. As punk emerged in the later 70s, the aesthetic shifted dramatically. Out went the glamour, and in came deliberate ugliness. Ripped clothing held together with safety pins, leather jackets covered in studs and spikes, mohawk haircuts dyed unnatural colours, heavy boots made for kicking, not dancing. Punk fashion was confrontational, designed to offend mainstream sensibilities and declare allegiance to a movement that rejected everything the older generation valued. Groupies were a phenomenon unto themselves, a subculture of young women who pursued relationships with rock musicians. The most successful groupies became celebrities within the scene, known by everyone, welcomed into dressing rooms and hotel rooms, treated like VIPs despite having no official role. Some groupies were genuinely passionate about music and sought intellectual and artistic connections with musicians. Others were primarily interested in status, in being able to say they'd slept with famous band members, collecting names like trophies. Many fell somewhere in between, drawn by a mixture of genuine admiration and the desire to be part of something exciting and important. The groupie scene had its own hierarchy and politics. The most beautiful, most connected groupies had access to the biggest stars. They could pick and choose which bands to pursue, which musicians to favour with their attention. Lower-tier groupies competed for access to lesser-known bands, hoping to catch a rising star before they became huge. Drugs were everywhere on the Sunset Strip, as ubiquitous as alcohol and nearly as openly consumed. Marijuana was baseline, the minimum requirement. Cocaine was king, especially as the decade progressed, and Miami Colombian cocaine began flooding into the United States in massive quantities. Cocaine fit the disco era perfectly. It made you energetic, confident, talkative, ready to party all night without fatigue. Quaaludes, a sedative prescribed for insomnia and anxiety, became a recreational drug beloved by the rock and roll crowd. Taking a few Quaaludes would leave you relaxed, uninhibited, and physically uncoordinated, a strange combination that somehow worked in social settings. The drug was eventually taken off the market in the 80s, after recreational use became epidemic. Heroin had always lurked at the edges of the music scene, periodically claiming lives. Janis Joplin in 1970, Jim Morrison in 1971. Though his death might have been from a heart attack brought on by other drugs, the details remaining unclear. Heroin was dangerous and stigmatized, associated with jazz musicians and the Beats, not as socially acceptable as stimulants or psychedelics. LSD and other psychedelics were still popular in certain circles, though less prevalent than in the 60s. Taking acid required commitment, 12 hours or more of altered consciousness, not ideal for a club environment where you needed to maintain some connection to reality. But people still tripped, particularly at concerts or parties where the experience could be shared. The drug dealing operated semi-openly. Everyone knew who sold what. Transactions happened in bathrooms, parking lots, VIP rooms. People would duck away for a few minutes, return with different energy, dilated pupils or runny noses giving away what they'd been doing. The police presence on the Strip was minimal, and what enforcement did occur focused on traffic violations and major disturbances, not recreational drug use. Violence was rare but not unknown. Fights would break out, usually over women or perceived disrespect. Someone would say something insulting, someone else would respond with fists, and suddenly you'd have bodies crashing into the crowd, drinks knocked over, bouncers wading in to separate the combatants and eject them from the venue. The more serious violence happened away from the main clubs, in parking lots or alleyways, in transactions gone wrong, or rivalries that escalated beyond words. The Strip attracted predators as well as dreamers, people who saw young, intoxicated targets and took advantage. Women especially were vulnerable, navigating a scene where their value was largely sexual and their safety wasn't prioritized. But most nights were just about music and connection, about hearing a band that made you feel something, about dancing until sweat soaked through your clothes, about finding someone attractive and making that clear, about the electric possibility that this night might be the night something amazing happened. The clubs closed around 2 a.m, though some had late licenses that let them operate until 4. When the music stopped and lights came up, the illusion broke. Everyone looked worse in bright light, makeup smeared, clothes disheveled, the magic evaporating. The crowd would spill onto Sunset Boulevard, blinking in the streetlights, trying to figure out what to do next. Some headed to Cantor's Deli on Fairfax, an all-night Jewish delicatessen, where you could get matzo ball soup and pastrami sandwiches at 3 a.m, fuel for the come-down. Others went to after-parties at hotels or houses in the hills, where the night continued until dawn or beyond. Still others just went home, alone or with company. The night's adventures over, sleep finally possible. The Sunset Strip in the 1970s was magic and misery, liberation and exploitation, the best of times for those who fit, in and exclusion for those who didn't. It was a place where cultural history was being made nightly, even if nobody realized it at the time. The music produced there, the relationships formed there, the attitudes and aesthetics developed there spread outward to reshape American popular culture. For every successful musician who got discovered on the Strip, 1,000 unknowns played to small crowds and went nowhere. For every groupie who ended up marrying a rock star, dozens aged out of the scene with nothing to show for their years of devotion. The Strip promised dreams and delivered reality, which was sometimes better and often worse than what people imagined. But for a brief window in the 70s, The Sunset Strip was the center of the rock and roll universe, a place where anything felt possible after dark, where night after night, magic happened under neon lights and everyone wanted to be part of it. While the Sunset Strip celebrated music, Hollywood itself was undergoing a revolution that would reshape cinema forever. The studio system that had dominated filmmaking since the 1920s was collapsing, and in its place, something stranger and more vital was emerging. The old studio bosses, men like Jack Warner and Darryl Zanuck, were aging or dying, their grip on the industry weakening. They'd built Hollywood into an entertainment factory, a place where movies were manufactured according to proven formulas, where stars were employees under 7-year contracts, where every aspect of production was controlled from above. That system had produced brilliant work, but it had also become rigid and out of touch. The audience was changing. By the mid-70s, 76% of moviegoers were under 30 years old, and 64% had attended college. These weren't the general audiences the studios had courted for decades. These were young, educated viewers who wanted something different, something that spoke to their experiences and concerns, not the polished fantasies their parents had consumed. European cinema was showing what was possible. Directors like Michelangelo Antonioni, François Truffaut and Ingmar Bergman were making films that broke narrative rules, dealt with adult themes honestly, and treated audiences like intelligent adults capable of handling ambiguity. American audiences, or at least the younger segment, responded enthusiastically to these imported films, proving there was a market for more challenging work. The studios were in financial trouble. Expensive flops had drained resources. The old model wasn't working anymore. In desperation, they began giving chances to young directors who had attended film school and grown up watching movies, who understood cinema as an art form and wanted to push boundaries. Francis Ford Coppola directed The Godfather in 1972, a film the studio expected to be a modest gangster picture. Instead, it became a cultural phenomenon, the highest-grossing film of all time upon its release, both critically acclaimed and massively profitable. Coppola proved you could make something artistically ambitious that also connected with mainstream audiences. The Godfather Part 2 followed in 1974, even more ambitious than the first, a complex narrative moving between timelines, exploring themes of family, power, and the corruption of the American dream. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, one of the rare sequels to achieve that honor. Martin Scorsese brought his gritty vision of New York to mean streets in 1973, then delivered Taxi Driver in 1976, a disturbing psychological portrait of urban alienation and violence. Robert De Niro's performance as Travis Bickle created an icon of American cinema, a disturbed loner whose famous mirror monologue captured something dark and true about masculinity and rage. Roman Polanski, already famous but working in Los Angeles, directed Chinatown in 1974, neo-noir that captured something essential about Los Angeles, the corruption, the water politics, the way money and power operated behind the scenes. Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway gave brilliant performances in a script by Robert Towne that is still studied in screenwriting classes as near-perfect structure and dialogue. Robert Altman brought his overlapping dialogue and ensemble approach to films like Nashville in 1975, a sprawling portrait of American culture using the country music industry as a lens. His style was loose and improvisational, trusting actors to discover moments rather than hitting predetermined marks. These directors and others like them, including Hal Ashby, Terrence Malick, and Bob Rafelson, created what became known as New Hollywood. The movement was characterized by personal vision, auteur theory put into practice, directors having final cut privileges and using them to make films that reflected their obsessions and concerns. The films were often darker than traditional Hollywood product. Anti-heroes replaced conventional heroes. Endings were ambiguous or outright bleak. The movies addressed Vietnam, Watergate, racial conflict, gender roles, all the social upheaval of the 60s and 70s that mainstream cinema had mostly ignored. Behind the scenes, the production process was changing. Location shooting replaced backlot work, giving films a grittier, more realistic look. Natural lighting and handheld cameras created documentary-like immediacy. Method acting, pioneered by Marlon Brando and absorbed by a new generation including De Niro, Pacino and Nicholson, brought psychological realism to performances. The studios gave directors freedom, but also expected commercial success. When films worked, directors were celebrated and given bigger budgets. But the freedom came with pressure, and not every auteur handled success well. Stories of ego, excess, and battles with studio executives became legendary. Hollywood parties in the 70s were epic events. Producers threw lavish gatherings in Beverly Hills mansions, at Malibu beach houses, in penthouses overlooking the city. The guest lists mixed established stars with rising talent, directors with agents, studio executives with screenwriters. Everyone was networking, pitching projects, making deals, sleeping with each other. Cocaine was the drug of choice in Hollywood, as it was on the Sunset Strip. The film industry ran on cocaine through much of the 70s and 80s. It was the perfect drug for the lifestyle, short-acting, energizing, making you confident and talkative, letting you work long hours and party late without apparent consequence. Until there were consequences, and careers crashed along with the people who thought they could control their usage. The Chateau Marmont on Sunset Boulevard was the unofficial hotel of the film industry, where actors stayed during productions, where affairs happened, where people could be themselves away from public scrutiny. The hotel had a European elegance and a policy of discretion that made it perfect for Hollywood's purposes. Countless movies have been written in Chateau Marmont rooms. Relationships have begun and ended there, and at least one famous death occurred there when John Belushi overdosed in Bungalow 3 in 1982. Being a struggling actor in 70s, Hollywood meant working survival jobs while going to auditions, hoping for a break that might never come. Tens of thousands of beautiful, talented people competed for a handful of roles. You needed incredible persistence, resilience to rejection, and usually a willingness to do things you weren't proud of to get opportunities. The casting couch was real. Sexual harassment and assault were routine and unpunished. Harvey Weinstein was still decades away from public exposure, but men like him existed then too, men who used their power to coerce sexual favors from actresses who had no recourse, no way to complain without destroying their own careers. Women's roles in film were improving slightly, thanks to the women's liberation movement, but progress was slow. Actresses aged out of leading roles in their 30s, while male actors continued playing romantic leads into their 50s and beyond. Women were judged on appearance first, talent second. The pressure to stay thin, stay young, stay attractive was immense and unhealthy. Television production was also booming in Los Angeles. The major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, filmed most of their shows in California. Studios that had once focused exclusively on theatrical films now had television divisions producing comedies and dramas for the small screen. Some of the era's most influential television was being made in Los Angeles. Norman Lear's sitcoms, including All in the Family, Maude, Good Times, and The Jeffersons, tackled social issues that entertainment television had traditionally avoided: racism, abortion, homosexuality, class conflict. The shows were funny but also uncomfortable, forcing audiences to think about difficult subjects. MTM Enterprises, founded by Grant Tinker and Mary Tyler Moore, produced quality comedies like The Mary Tyler Moore Show and dramas like Hill Street Blues that elevated television's ambitions. The writing was sharp, the acting professional, the production values high. Aaron Spelling created glossy escapist programming like Charlie's Angels, The Love Boat, and Fantasy Island, shows that offered wish fulfillment rather than social commentary. The shows were criticized for being shallow, but they were enormously popular, and Spelling became one of the most successful producers in television history. The adult film industry operated in parallel to mainstream Hollywood, less celebrated but financially significant. The early 70s saw pornography achieve an unusual cultural moment, sometimes called the golden age of porn, when hardcore films were discussed in mainstream media and attended by regular audiences curious about the new permissiveness. Deep Throat premiered in 1972 and became a genuine phenomenon, playing in respectable theatres and grossing enormous sums. Celebrities admitted to seeing it. Couples attended together. The film's star, Linda Lovelace, became famous, though she would later claim she had been forced into the performance through abuse and threats by her controlling husband. The adult film industry was concentrated in the San Fernando Valley, where production costs were lower and zoning was more permissive. Studios produced hundreds of films, some with actual plots and production values, others just documenting sexual acts. Performers made little money despite the industry's profits. Drug use was endemic. AIDS would devastate the community in the 80s, but in the 70s that horror was still unforeseen. The Hollywood film industry looked down on adult films officially while sometimes envying their profitability. Some mainstream actors and directors worked in porn under pseudonyms to make ends meet. The line between the industries was more porous than anyone wanted to admit. 1974 stands out as perhaps the peak year of 70s Hollywood creativity. The Godfather Part 2 was released, Chinatown premiered. The Conversation, Coppola's paranoid thriller about surveillance, earned critical acclaim. Blazing Saddles brought Mel Brooks' anarchic comedy to the big screen. Young Frankenstein, also from Brooks, became a classic. The Towering Inferno represented the disaster movie trend at its most spectacular. The films released in 1974 showed the range of what American cinema could achieve: intimate character studies and epic spectacles, comedies and dramas, experimental narratives and crowd-pleasing entertainment. Directors had freedom to follow their vision. Studios were willing to take risks. Audiences were open to different kinds of stories. But the seeds of change were already planted. In 1975, Steven Spielberg released Jaws, a thriller about a shark terrorizing a beach town. The film was a sensation, opening in hundreds of theaters simultaneously, a new strategy called saturation booking. It became the highest-grossing film of all time, destroying previous records. Jaws proved you could make enormous amounts of money with the right kind of film released at the right time with the right marketing. The era of the blockbuster had begun, and it would gradually strangle the artistic freedom that had characterized the early 70s. Star Wars followed in 1977, another Spielberg-adjacent project that George Lucas directed. The film was even more successful than Jaws, creating a cultural phenomenon that extended far beyond the movie itself. Action figures, lunchboxes, t-shirts, sequels, the merchandising possibilities were endless. Studios learned the lesson. Why make 10 mid-budget films hoping a few succeed when you could make one huge film that might gross hundreds of millions? The auteur era was ending even as its greatest works were being released. By the end of the decade, the industry was shifting toward the blockbuster model that would dominate in the 80s and beyond. Hollywood in the 70s was a moment of creative possibility before the business side reasserted control. Directors got to make the films they wanted. Consequences be damned. Some of those films are masterpieces that will endure as long as cinema exists. Others are interesting failures, ambitious projects that didn't quite work but tried something new. Together, they represent American cinema at its most vital, most willing to take risks, most connected to the culture it was trying to capture and critique. The legacy of 70s Hollywood lives on in every ambitious film that follows, in every director who fights for creative control, in every movie that tries to say something meaningful about the world rather than just entertaining audiences. The dream may have faded, but it existed, and it produced work that proved what cinema could be when artists were given freedom and trust. Los Angeles in the 70s was perhaps the most musically fertile place on Earth, generating sounds that would define the decade and influence everything that followed. Multiple genres thrived simultaneously, from singer-songwriter introspection to punk rock rage, from disco glamour to the early stirrings of hip-hop. Laurel Canyon, winding through the Hollywood Hills, became synonymous with a particular sound: acoustic guitars, harmonies, introspective lyrics about relationships and self-discovery. The canyon was home to a remarkable concentration of musical talent living in close proximity, inspiring and influencing each other. Joni Mitchell lived in a small house on Lookout Mountain Avenue. Her writing was becoming more complex and jazz-influenced, moving from the folk sound of her early work towards something more experimental. Albums like Blue in 1971 and Court and Spark in 1974 showcased her development, both commercially successful and artistically ambitious. Crosby, Stills and Nash had formed at Mitchell's house in July 1969, their first harmonies discovered during an impromptu jam session. With the addition of Neil Young, the group became one of the defining acts of the era. Their blend of rock and folk and country creating something uniquely American. Their harmonies were crystalline, and their songs addressed both personal relationships and political concerns. Jackson Browne was writing songs in Laurel Canyon that captured a particular California melancholy, a sense that the dreams of the 60s had curdled into something more complicated. His 1972 self-titled debut album and subsequent releases, like Late for the Sky in 1974, earned critical acclaim and commercial success, establishing him as one of the premier songwriters of his generation. The Eagles formed in Los Angeles in 1971, their country rock sound initially rooted in the Laurel Canyon aesthetic before evolving toward more polished, commercially massive productions. Hotel California, released in 1976, became one of the best-selling albums ever, its title track a commentary on Los Angeles excess and spiritual emptiness that somehow became an anthem anyway. Linda Ronstadt was the queen of the canyon scene, her powerful voice and wide-ranging taste taking her from country to rock to pop to standards. She recorded in Los Angeles studios with the best session musicians, her albums consistently charting high and selling millions. The session musicians who played on these records were Los Angeles legends themselves. The Wrecking Crew, a loose collective of studio pros, appeared on countless hits. Hal Blaine on drums, Carol Kay on bass, Larry Knechtel on keyboards. These musicians could play anything in any style, and they made everyone sound better. The recording studios were crucial infrastructure. Sound City and Van Nuys had the console and acoustics that captured drum sounds perfectly, making it the preferred location for rock recordings. Capitol Records on Vine Street had been there since the 40s, a circular tower that looked like a stack of records, where everyone from Frank Sinatra to the Beach Boys had recorded. Sunset Sound on Sunset Boulevard handled everything from The Doors to Van Halen. While singer-songwriters were crafting introspective folk rock in the canyons, punk rock was germinating in the clubs and garages of Los Angeles. The movement started in New York with bands like the Ramones and Television, but Los Angeles developed its own scene that was harder, faster, and angrier than almost anything happening elsewhere. The Germs formed in 1977, led by Darby Crash, a charismatic self-destructive singer who treated performances as opportunities for chaos. The music was raw and barely controlled, the lyrics nihilistic and confrontational. Crash would cut himself on stage, dive into the crowd, create violent spectacles that were both compelling and disturbing. He would die of a heroin overdose in December 1980, just as the Germs were achieving wider recognition. X brought artistry and intelligence to punk while maintaining its visceral power. John Doe and Exene Cervenka's married couple dynamic added complexity to their performances. Their lyrics referenced literature and poetry alongside street-level observations. The music was tight and powerful, owing as much to rockabilly as to punk orthodoxy. Black Flag, though more associated with Hermosa Beach than Los Angeles proper, was perhaps the most influential hardcore punk band to emerge from Southern California. They played faster and heavier than almost anyone. Their shows were violent mosh pits where injuries were expected, and their DIY ethic inspired a generation of bands to make music without waiting for industry permission. The Weirdos, the Screamers, the Dickies, Middle Class, dozens of bands formed in Los Angeles in the late 70s, each adding something to the punk sound. Some lasted a few years, others only a few months. They played at the Mask, a club in a basement downtown, at the Starwood on Santa Monica Boulevard, at any venue that would book them. Punk fashion in Los Angeles was distinctive. Black leather jackets covered in painted slogans and band names, ripped jeans held together with safety pins, heavy boots perfect for stomping in the pit. Hair was spiked with gel or shaved into mohawks, dyed colours that didn't occur in nature. The look was deliberately ugly, a rejection of mainstream beauty standards and disco glamour. The punk scene was also remarkably inclusive. Gay, straight, male, female, everyone was welcome as long as you embraced the music and the ethos. In a decade still deeply homophobic, punk clubs offered a rare space where sexual orientation didn't matter nearly as much as authenticity and commitment to the scene. Disco arrived in Los Angeles slightly behind its birth in New York, but quickly made up for lost time. Studio 54 might have been the most famous disco in America, but Los Angeles had its own temples to the dance floor where the beautiful people gathered to see and be seen. The disco sound was designed for movement, Built on a steady four-on-the-floor beat that pulled bodies onto the floor, strings swelled and horns punctuated, bass lines throbbed, and singers delivered lyrics about love and celebration and freedom. The music was joy packaged for commercial consumption, and millions of people bought it eagerly. Studio One in West Hollywood was the premier gay disco, a massive club where the LGBTQ community could dance without harassment. The vibe was liberating, men dancing with men without fear, everyone dressed in tight clothes that showed off gym-toned bodies. Donna Summer's voice would fill the space, singing about feeling love or hot stuff, and the crowd would respond with pure physical ecstasy. Osco's in Beverly Hills attracted a more mixed crowd, wealthy straight people who wanted to experience disco culture in a safe, upscale environment. The Daisy in Beverly Hills was exclusive and expensive, requiring membership and enforcing dress codes, keeping out anyone who didn't fit their vision of glamorous. Disco fashion was the opposite of punk, shiny and expensive looking, even when it was cheap. Men wore tight pants and shirts unbuttoned to show chest and gold chains. Women wore dresses covered in sequins that caught the light with every move, or halter tops and hot pants showing maximum skin. Platform shoes added height. Hair was carefully styled, makeup was dramatic. The goal was to look like you belonged in the spotlight. Cocaine and disco were inseparable. The drug kept you energized for all-night dancing, made you confident and sociable, fit the culture perfectly. Dealers worked the clubs, transactions happening in bathrooms and dark corners, everyone pretending not to notice as people disappeared and returned with different energy. The backlash against disco grew through the late 70s, fueled by racism and homophobia as much as musical taste. Rock fans rejected disco as fake and commercial, though that criticism could have been applied to plenty of rock as well. The Disco Sucks movement culminated in Disco Demolition Night in Chicago in 1979, when thousands of disco records were blown up between games of a baseball doubleheader, the crowd turning violent and forcing cancellation of the second game. The Troubadour on Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood was a venue that transcended genre, booking everyone from folk singers to hard rock bands. The club had been around since the 50s, but the 70s were its golden age. The stage was small, the room intimate, the sound system excellent. Elton John made his American debut at the Troubadour in August 1970. 5 shows that announced the arrival of a major talent. The pianist-singer performed in sequined outfits, his blend of rock and pop and theatrical presentation unlike anything American audiences had seen. He became a superstar almost immediately, one of the biggest-selling artists of the decade. James Taylor played the Troubadour early in his career, his gentle voice and acoustic guitar creating intimate moments in the small room. His songs about personal struggle and recovery resonated with audiences, and his style defined a certain strain of introspective 70s pop. The Forum in Inglewood, a large arena south of Los Angeles, hosted the massive rock concerts that the biggest bands required. Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, any band that could sell out 15,000 seats played the Forum. The shows were spectacles, complete with elaborate light shows, massive speaker systems that could deafen the front rows, and audiences high on whatever drugs they'd managed to sneak past security. Radio stations shaped musical taste and broke new songs. KMET was the dominant rock station, playing album cuts and allowing DJs to program with minimal corporate interference. Jim Ladd was a legendary DJ there, famous for crafting musical journeys that flowed from one song to the next, with a narrative logic, educating listeners about deep cuts and album sides. KROQ started making noise in the late 70s, as punk and new wave emerged. The station would become massively influential in the 80s, but in the late 70s it was still finding its identity, taking risks on strange new bands from England and adventurous local acts. The music industry itself was concentrated in Los Angeles, with major labels maintaining offices and executives making decisions about what America would hear. Getting signed to a major label was the dream of every musician in the city, the goal that justified years of struggle and poverty. A&R representatives, the talent scouts who signed new acts, frequented clubs looking for the next big thing. They had expense accounts for entertaining musicians and buying drinks, power to offer contracts that could change lives. Some were genuinely passionate about music and development of artists. Others were just looking for quick commercial success, signing acts that fit current trends and dropping them the moment sales softened. Recording contracts in the 70s often favoured labels over artists, a reality that led to horror stories of musicians making hit records and seeing little money. The business side of music was predatory, taking advantage of young musicians who didn't understand contracts or negotiate effectively. Managers and lawyers who protected artists were valuable, but they took their percentage, and even successful musicians often found themselves broke despite selling millions of records. The music made in Los Angeles during the 70s was staggeringly diverse. Country rock, singer-songwriter folk, punk and hardcore, disco and funk, the early sounds of hip-hop emerging from black communities, experimental jazz fusion, classic rock, all happening simultaneously in the same city. You could see any of it on any night if you knew where to look. This musical abundance reflected and shaped Los Angeles culture. The city was a place where reinvention was possible, where you could create a new identity, where the future was being written in real time. The music captured that possibility, that energy, that sense of anything being achievable if you wanted it badly enough and worked hard enough and got lucky. Not everyone made it. For every success story, there were hundreds of musicians who never got signed, who spent years developing their craft and found no audience, who eventually gave up and found other work, their dreams abandoned. Los Angeles was littered with former musicians driving cabs, waiting tables, working construction, their guitars gathering dust in closets. But the ones who succeeded created the soundtrack of the decade, songs that still resonate, albums that are still played and studied and loved. The music industry may have been ruthless and exploitative, but it also provided a path for talented people to reach millions of listeners, to make art that mattered, to create work that would outlive them. Los Angeles in the 70s was where music happened, where trends started, where artists became legends. The city's influence on American music during this period cannot be overstated. What was recorded in Los Angeles studios, performed in Los Angeles clubs, and broadcast from Los Angeles radio stations shaped what the entire country heard and loved and argued about. The city was the beating heart of American popular music, and its rhythm echoed everywhere. The shadow of the Manson family murders hung over Los Angeles throughout the 70s, a constant reminder that the counterculture's promise of peace and love could mutate into something monstrous. But the Manson family wasn't the only cult operating in and around Los Angeles. The city seemed to attract charismatic leaders and vulnerable followers in unusual numbers, creating communities that ranged from merely strange to genuinely dangerous. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers dominated Los Angeles news throughout 1970 and into 1971. The courtroom proceedings were theatrical and disturbing. Manson carved an X into his forehead, which his followers copied. The female defendants giggled and sang during testimony about brutal murders. The prosecuting attorney, Vincent Bugliosi, constructed a narrative about helter-skelter, the apocalyptic race war Manson supposedly believed was imminent. The trial revealed details that shocked even people familiar with the case. The level of violence at the murder scenes, the messages written in blood on walls, the randomness of the victim selection, all contributed to a sense that the murders represented something beyond ordinary crime. This was nihilism made flesh, a rejection of all moral frameworks, an embrace of chaos and death. Manson was convicted of first-degree murder despite not personally killing anyone. The prosecution argued successfully that his control over his followers made him responsible for their actions. He was sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment, when California temporarily abolished capital punishment. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, becoming a symbol of evil in popular culture, giving interviews where he rambled incoherently, playing guitar and recording songs that no major label would release. The female followers also received death sentences commuted to life. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were young when they committed their crimes, early 20s or younger, and they would grow old in prison. Over the decades, they would express remorse, participate in rehabilitation programs, and repeatedly be denied parole despite becoming model prisoners. The parole board couldn't forget what they'd done, and neither could the public. Synanon started as a drug rehabilitation program in Santa Monica in 1958. founded by Charles Dederick, a former alcoholic who believed traditional treatment programs didn't work. The approach was confrontational, breaking down participants' egos through aggressive group therapy sessions called The Game, where people verbally attacked each other's defenses and justifications. Initially, Synanon achieved genuine success, helping addicts get clean. But over time, the organization evolved into something cult-like. Dederick became increasingly authoritarian, demanding absolute obedience from members. The organization accumulated wealth and property. Dederick declared that Synanon was a religion, qualifying it for tax-exempt status. By the mid-70s, Synanon had become dangerous. The organization maintained a military-style security force. People who criticized Synanon faced intimidation and violence. In 1978, 2 Synanon members placed a rattlesnake in the mailbox of attorney Paul Morantz, who had sued the organization on behalf of a former member. The snake bit Morantz, nearly killing him. Dederick and other members were arrested and convicted. Synanon attracted attention because it included successful, educated people among its members. Hollywood celebrities and business leaders joined, either seeking treatment or believing in the community Dederick promised. The organization ran legitimate businesses and donated to charities, creating a respectable facade that hid the authoritarian control and potential for violence underneath. The People's Temple had Los Angeles roots before its tragic ending in Jonestown, Guyana, in November 1978. Jim Jones, the temple's leader, established a church in Los Angeles in the early 70s, attracting a racially integrated congregation with messages of social justice and racial equality. Jones was a skilled manipulator who used religion as a vehicle for control. He claimed to perform miracles, healings that were actually staged with the help of accomplices. He demanded loyalty and obedience, gradually isolating members from their families and friends. He collected money and property from followers, accumulating the resources needed to eventually relocate the entire community to Guyana. In Los Angeles, the People's Temple maintained a progressive image. Jones cultivated relationships with politicians and community leaders. The church ran programs helping the poor and addicted. Members were encouraged to participate in political campaigns, giving the temple influence in local politics. But people who left the temple told stories of abuse, of physical punishment, of forced confessions and humiliation. Jones was becoming increasingly paranoid, convinced that enemies were conspiring against him. He talked about revolutionary suicide, a concept that would become horrifically real in Jonestown. When the temple moved to Guyana in 1977, establishing a compound in the jungle, concerns grew among families of members and former members. Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown in November 1978 to investigate. When Ryan tried to leave with temple members who wanted to escape, Jones ordered his murder at the airstrip. Then Jones commanded his followers to drink cyanide-laced punch. Over 900 people died, including 300 children. It remains the largest mass death of American civilians in a single incident until September 11, 2001. The tragedy shocked the world and Los Angeles in particular. Many of the dead had been Los Angeles residents. Families who had warned about the temple felt vindicated but devastated. The incident raised questions about how such an organization could have operated openly, attracting members and political support without anyone stopping it. S-training was a different kind of transformational experience, less obviously cult-like, but still controversial. Founded by Werner Erhard in 1971, EST offered intensive weekend seminars that promised personal transformation through confrontational techniques. Participants spent hours in sessions where they were verbally abused, denied bathroom, breaks and pushed to psychological breaking points, all supposedly to achieve enlightenment. Thousands of Los Angeles residents went through S-training, including celebrities and entertainment industry professionals. The organization earned millions of dollars from its seminars. Some participants reported genuine positive changes in their lives. Others described the experience as abusive and manipulative, using cult-like techniques to break down resistance and indoctrinate participants into Erhard's philosophy. Transcendental meditation, promoted by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, was enormously popular in Los Angeles. The practice involved sitting quietly and repeating a personal mantra, supposedly achieving deep rest and expanded consciousness. The Beach Boys promoted TM, The Beatles had famously visited the Maharishi's ashram in India, and celebrity endorsements made the practice fashionable. TM centers opened throughout Los Angeles, offering courses and selling mantras. The organization claimed the practice had scientific benefits, reducing stress and improving health. Critics argued it was Hinduism repackaged for Western consumers, a commercialized spirituality that charged money for techniques that were traditionally free. The human potential movement encompassed various therapies, workshops, and practices aimed at self-improvement and expanded consciousness. Esalen Institute in Big Sur, while not in Los Angeles proper, influenced the city's culture significantly. Encounter groups, primal scream therapy, rolfing, rebirthing, various bodywork and emotional release techniques found enthusiastic audiences in Los Angeles. These movements attracted intelligent, successful people searching for meaning beyond material success. The counterculture had promised enlightenment and community, and when that promise failed, people looked for alternatives. Some found genuine help and growth. Others were exploited by leaders who promised transformation while mainly seeking money and control. Los Angeles seemed particularly vulnerable to charismatic leaders and alternative communities. The reasons were multiple: the transient nature of the population, many people having moved to California, leaving family and traditional support structures behind; the entertainment industry's focus on appearance and success, creating deep insecurity; the spiritual seeking that had characterized the 60s continuing into the 70s; the city's size and anonymity making it possible for organizations to operate without the scrutiny they might face in smaller communities. The cults and movements of 70s Los Angeles shared certain characteristics. They offered community to lonely people, purpose to those feeling aimless, certainty in an uncertain world. They demanded commitment, money, and obedience. They isolated members from outside influences. They created us versus them mentalities, convincing followers that outsiders couldn't understand or were actively hostile. Not every alternative community was dangerous, of course. Many spiritual groups, therapy organizations, and communal living situations were benign, providing genuine benefits to participants. The line between helpful community and destructive cult wasn't always clear, and reasonable people disagreed about where to draw it. But the Manson murders and Jonestown massacre demonstrated that the line existed, and that crossing it could be fatal. The optimistic belief that all alternative lifestyles and spiritual paths were equally valid and harmless died in the 70s, replaced by wariness and skepticism toward charismatic leaders making grand promises. The legacy of 70s cult activity shaped how Americans thought about new religious movements and alternative communities. The term "drinking the Kool-Aid," derived from the Jonestown poisonings, entered the language as shorthand for blind obedience to dangerous leadership. Parents worried about children joining strange groups. Exit counselors and deprogrammers emerged to help families extract members from cults. Los Angeles moved forward, but the shadow remained. The city that had promised reinvention and new possibilities had also demonstrated that not all transformations were positive, that the search for meaning could lead into darkness as easily as light, that paradise always harbored serpents if you knew where to look. While Los Angeles was generating art and music and transforming American culture, it was also becoming increasingly violent and dangerous. The crime wave that would peak in the early 90s was building through the 70s, reshaping neighborhoods and creating an atmosphere of fear that affected everyone, especially those living in the most economically disadvantaged areas. Gang culture was emerging as a dominant force in south-central Los Angeles. The Crips formed around 1969, started by Raymond Washington and Stanley Tookie Williams, who were both teenagers. Initially, the gang was relatively small, focused on the neighborhood around Fremont High School. But the Crips grew rapidly, attracting young men who saw gang membership as providing protection, status, and economic opportunity in communities where legitimate opportunities were scarce. The Bloods formed in response to Crips aggression, various smaller gangs and unaffiliated youths coming together for mutual protection. The rivalry between Crips and Bloods would become one of the defining features of Los Angeles gang culture, generating violence that would claim thousands of lives over the decades. Gang members identified themselves through colours, blue for Crips and red for Bloods, and through hand signs, specific ways of folding fingers and positioning hands to declare affiliation. The colours and signs created a visual language of allegiance and threat, turning ordinary clothing and gestures into potentially life-or-death declarations. In the early 70s, gang violence was mostly fistfights and occasional stabbings. Guns were less prevalent, less powerful. But as the decade progressed, firearms became more common and more deadly. Drive-by shootings emerged as a tactic, gang members firing from cars at rival territory or specific targets, then speeding away before retaliation was possible. The drug trade accelerated gang growth and violence. Marijuana had always generated income, but cocaine, especially the crack cocaine that would arrive in the 80s, created enormous profit potential. Gangs controlled territory, and territory meant control over drug sales locations. Rival gangs competing for the same markets fought viciously, and the violence spilled over onto anyone who happened to be nearby. The Los Angeles Police Department's relationship with Black and Latino communities was hostile and deteriorating. The Watts riots of 1965 had been triggered by an incident of police brutality, and the underlying tensions hadn't been resolved. LAPD officers were predominantly white, policing neighborhoods they didn't live in or understand, often treating all residents as potential criminals. Chief Darrell Gates, who would lead the LAPD through much of the 80s, embodied the aggressive law enforcement philosophy that dominated the department. The approach was confrontational rather than community-oriented, emphasizing force and control over relationship building and prevention. SWAT teams, special weapons and tactics units, were developed in Los Angeles and used with increasing frequency. Corruption within the LAPD was an open secret. Officers supplemented their income through bribes, protecting illegal operations in exchange for payments, stealing during raids, framing suspects they believed were guilty but lacked evidence to convict legally. Not all officers were corrupt, but the culture permitted and sometimes encouraged behavior that violated the oath to serve and protect. Organized crime maintained a presence in Los Angeles, though less overtly than in cities like New York or Chicago. The mafia had influence in various industries: entertainment, construction, trucking, waste management. Protection rackets operated in certain neighborhoods, businesses paying for security that was actually just money to avoid harassment or violence. The Hillside Strangler terrorized Los Angeles from October 1977 through February 1978, a period when women were being kidnapped, raped, and murdered, their bodies left on hillsides around the city. The name suggested a single killer, but investigators eventually discovered there were two: Kenneth Bianchi and his cousin Angelo Buono. The murders followed a pattern. Young women, often sex workers or runaways, would disappear from the Hollywood area. Days or weeks later, their bodies would be discovered, posed in humiliating positions, bearing signs of torture and sexual assault. The level of sadism was extreme, suggesting the killers took pleasure in their victims' suffering. Los Angeles women changed their behavior during the killing spree. They traveled in groups, avoided being alone, carried weapons, looked over their shoulders constantly. The police investigation was massive but initially ineffective, following leads that went nowhere while the bodies continued appearing. The killers were caught almost by accident. Bianchi had moved to Washington state and committed murders there using similar methods. When arrested, he eventually confessed and implicated Buono. The trials and convictions brought some closure, but the terror of those months remained in the city's collective memory. Drug trafficking was becoming increasingly organized and violent. Mexican cartels controlled marijuana and heroin smuggling across the border. Colombian cocaine was arriving in ever larger quantities, primarily through Miami but with Los Angeles as a secondary entry point and major market. The money was staggering, billions of dollars in untaxed profits, creating incentives for violence that law enforcement struggled to counter. Street-level drug dealing operated through networks of dealers, each level taking a cut as product moved from wholesale to retail. The lowest-level dealers, often teenagers, faced the most risk and made the least money, vulnerable to arrest and violence from customers, rivals, and suppliers. But the money was better than minimum-wage fast food jobs, assuming you survived long enough to spend it. Addiction was widespread and stigmatized. Heroin users were considered moral failures rather than people with a disease requiring treatment. Addicts supported their habits through crime, prostitution, and hustling, living desperate existences in Skid Row and other areas where the city's safety net had failed completely. Skid Row, the area of downtown Los Angeles where homeless and addicted populations concentrated, was a nightmare of human misery. Thousands of people lived on the streets, in cardboard boxes and makeshift shelters, without sanitation or security. Services were minimal, primarily provided by religious charities rather than government programs. The area was dangerous, with assaults and robberies common, but police largely ignored it unless violence spilled over into adjacent neighborhoods. Kidnappings made headlines when they involved wealthy or prominent families. Ransom demands could reach millions of dollars, and some families paid rather than risk their loved one's death. Professional kidnappers researched their targets carefully, choosing victims whose families had money but weren't important enough to trigger massive law enforcement response. The Getty family experienced a notorious kidnapping in 1973, though technically it occurred in Italy. John Paul Getty III, grandson of oil magnate J. Paul Getty, was kidnapped and held for 5 months. His grandfather initially refused to pay ransom, believing it would encourage more kidnappings. The kidnappers cut off the victim's ear and mailed it to a newspaper before Getty finally paid. The incident demonstrated that even extreme wealth couldn't guarantee safety. Burglary was epidemic in Los Angeles, particularly in wealthy neighborhoods, where homes contained valuable items worth stealing. Professional burglars surveilled properties, waited for residents to leave, then broke in quickly and methodically, taking jewelry, cash, art, anything portable and valuable. They worked alone or in small teams, selling stolen goods to fences who moved them into the legitimate market. Home security systems were becoming more common in response to the crime wave. Alarm companies sold systems that would supposedly detect intruders and alert police, though response times were often slow and false alarms were frequent. Guard dogs became popular. German shepherds and Dobermans trained to attack intruders. Neighborhoods organized watch programs, residents monitoring the streets for suspicious activity. The wealthy could afford private security companies that provided armed guards and rapid response. In Beverly Hills and other upscale areas, private security supplemented, or essentially, replaced regular police patrols. The message was clear. Safety was a commodity you purchased, and those who couldn't afford it would have to manage with whatever protection the overwhelmed LAPD could provide. Arson for profit was a growing problem. Building owners facing financial difficulties would hire arsonists to burn their properties, then collect insurance money. The fires endangered tenants and neighbors, sometimes killing people, but the financial incentives were strong enough that the practice continued despite legal penalties. The justice system struggled to handle the volume of crime. Courts were backlogged, trials delayed for years, prosecutors were overwhelmed, forced to plea bargain cases they should have taken to trial because resources didn't exist to prosecute everyone fully. Public defenders carried impossible caseloads, unable to provide adequate representation to their clients. Prisons were filling beyond capacity. California's prison population was growing rapidly, driven by longer sentences and higher conviction rates. The conditions inside were brutal, violence and rape common, gangs controlling many facilities, guards outnumbered and sometimes complicit in the dysfunction. The death penalty had been temporarily abolished in California following a state Supreme Court ruling in 1972, a decision later affirmed when California voters rejected a proposition to reinstate it in 1973. Criminals who would have been executed instead received life sentences, adding to prison population pressures. Crime shaped where people lived and how they behaved. White flight accelerated through the 70s, middle-class white families leaving urban neighborhoods for suburbs that felt safer, leaving behind communities that became poorer and more isolated. The tax base declined in areas experiencing white flight, reducing resources for schools and services, creating a downward spiral difficult to escape. Neighborhoods developed reputations that affected property values and investment. Areas perceived as dangerous saw businesses close, buildings deteriorate, crime increase further. The reputation became self-fulfilling, driving away anyone with resources to leave and attracting criminal activity that confirmed the worst fears. But even in the most dangerous neighborhoods, most residents were law-abiding people trying to live their lives, raise their families, and survive despite the chaos around them. They were the victims of crime, not the perpetrators, suffering both from criminal activity and from police who treated them with suspicion and hostility. The crime problem in 70s Los Angeles was ultimately a symptom of deeper failures: economic inequality, racial segregation, inadequate education and social services, a criminal justice system more focused on punishment than prevention or rehabilitation. The symptoms were treated with force, longer sentences, more aggressive policing, but the underlying causes remained largely unaddressed. As the decade ended, Los Angeles was more violent than it had been at the beginning, the trajectory toward the peak crime years of the late 80s and early 90s clear to anyone paying attention. The city of dreams had become, for many residents, a city of nightmares, where safety was never guaranteed and violence could erupt anywhere, anytime, for reasons that made sense only to those pulling the triggers. Los Angeles was never a single city, but rather a collection of distinct neighborhoods, each with its own character, demographics, and story. To understand 1970s Los Angeles, you had to understand these smaller communities, the places where people actually lived, rather than the glamorous image projected to the world. Venice Beach was perhaps the most eclectic neighborhood in Los Angeles, a place where counterculture, bodybuilding, artistic ambition, and outright strangeness converged on the sand. The Venice canals, dug in 1905 to recreate Venice, Italy, were deteriorating by the 70s, filled with stagnant water and garbage, but they added to the neighborhood's distinctive character. The Venice boardwalk was a carnival of humanity. Bodybuilders lifted weights at Muscle Beach, their oiled torsos on display for tourists and admirers. Arnold Schwarzenegger worked out there in the early 70s, building the physique that would make him a champion bodybuilder before his film career took off. Lou Ferrigno, who would play the Incredible Hulk on television, was another Muscle Beach regular. Street performers worked the boardwalk. Musicians, magicians, artists painting portraits, acrobats, fire breathers, anyone who could attract a crowd and collect donations. The atmosphere was carnival-like, tolerant of behavior that would be shut down in more conventional neighborhoods. Artists found cheap rent in Venice and established studios where they could work. The neighborhood had a bohemian reputation that attracted creative people who couldn't afford hipper areas. Galleries displayed local work, sometimes experimental and boundary-pushing, sometimes derivative, always earnest in its artistic ambitions. The housing was mixed: beautiful old beach houses with ocean views, run-down apartment buildings with cheap rent, new construction targeting the wealthy who were beginning to discover Venice as the next neighborhood to gentrify. The process was just beginning in the 70s, the full transformation to expensive real estate still decades away. Silver Lake and Echo Park, neighborhoods in the hills northeast of downtown, were working-class areas with an artistic edge. The housing was older, mostly small homes and apartment buildings built in the 20s through 50s. Rent was cheap compared to West Side neighborhoods, making the area attractive to musicians, artists and writers who needed affordable spaces. These neighborhoods had significant Latino populations, families who had lived there for generations alongside newer immigrants. The cultural mix created interesting dynamics: taco trucks operating next to coffee houses, Catholic churches sharing streets with punk venues. Reservoir, the water storage facility in Silver Lake, provided a scenic focal point, a place for walks and picnics with views of downtown and the surrounding hills. The architecture included some beautiful mid-century modern homes, designed by important architects and perched on hillsides with dramatic views. Watts, in south-central Los Angeles, was still recovering from the devastating riots of August 1965, when decades of frustration with poverty, police brutality, and racial discrimination exploded into 5 days of violence, arson, and looting. 34 people died, over 1,000 were injured, and huge sections of the neighborhood burned. The Watts Towers, an iconic sculptural landmark created by Italian immigrant Simon Rodia over 33 years, stood as a symbol of artistic creation in a neighborhood many outsiders saw only as a site of destruction. The towers were intricate structures built from steel and covered with found objects, Bottles, tiles, shells, and other materials Rodier collected and incorporated into his vision. But the neighborhood struggled economically. Businesses destroyed in the riots often weren't rebuilt. Unemployment was high. Schools were underfunded and overcrowded. The housing was primarily single-family homes and small apartment buildings, much of it deteriorating from neglect and lack of investment. Residents of Watts were predominantly black, families who had migrated from the South and found opportunity in Los Angeles during and after World War II, working in shipyards and factories. But by the 70s, many of those industrial jobs had disappeared, leaving communities without economic foundations. Gang activity was increasing in Watts, as it was throughout South Central. Young men joined gangs for protection, status, and economic opportunity through the drug trade. Violence was becoming normalized, expected, a fact of life rather than an aberration. Chinatown and Little Tokyo maintained their identities as ethnic enclaves, though both were under pressure from development and demographic change. Chinatown, located near downtown, was a center for Chinese restaurants, groceries, and cultural institutions. The architecture included traditional Chinese design elements, creating an exotic atmosphere that attracted tourists alongside, serving the practical needs of Chinese residents. Little Tokyo, also near downtown, was smaller and more threatened. The Japanese-American population had been devastated by internment during World War II, families losing businesses and property they'd spent generations building. By the 70s, the community was rebuilding, but facing pressure from redevelopment projects that threatened historic buildings and cultural sites. Both neighborhoods maintained cultural traditions, celebrating Lunar New Year and other holidays, operating language schools for children to learn Chinese or Japanese, hosting festivals that educated outsiders while reinforcing community bonds. They were genuine neighborhoods, not theme parks, though the line between authentic culture and tourist attraction was sometimes difficult to maintain. Koreatown was emerging as a distinct neighborhood in the 70s, centered around Olympic Boulevard and Western Avenue. Korean immigration was increasing dramatically following changes to immigration law in 1965, and Los Angeles became a major destination. Korean businesses opened, restaurants, grocery stores, churches, professional offices, creating infrastructure for the growing community. The neighborhood was transitioning, Korean businesses and residents moving into an area that had previously been predominantly Latino and working-class white. Tensions sometimes emerged over business practices, language barriers, and cultural differences, but mostly the transition was peaceful, simply one wave of immigrants succeeding another in the eternal pattern of Los Angeles development. Korean barbecue restaurants were introducing Angelinos to a cuisine that would become massively popular. The interactive element of cooking meat at your table, the parade of side dishes called banchan, the combination of flavors, all proved appealing to adventurous diners willing to try something unfamiliar. The San Fernando Valley was suburban Los Angeles, square miles of tract homes, shopping malls, and wide boulevards. Sherman Oaks, Van Nuys, Reseda, Northridge, Woodland Hills. These communities offered affordable housing for middle-class families, good schools, parks for children, and access to Los Angeles employment without living in the urban core's chaos. Valley culture had its own identity, distinct from the cooler image of Westside Los Angeles. It was more mainstream, less concerned with trends, focused on family and stability. Valley girls and guys developed a particular way of speaking, a drawl and vocabulary that would be satirized in the 80s song Valley Girl by Frank Zappa and his daughter Moon Unit. But the Valley also had its interesting corners. Laurel Canyon extended up into the hills. Topanga Canyon was even more rural and countercultural, and pockets of artistic and musical activity existed throughout. The Valley wasn't as boring as snobbish Westsiders claimed, just different, prioritizing different values. Cruising culture was huge in the Valley. Van Nuys Boulevard on Wednesday nights became a moving party, thousands of teenagers driving slowly up and down the street in their cars, windows down, music playing, watching and being watched. The cars were an essential part of identity, customized and maintained as rolling statements of personality. Malibu represented the ultimate Los Angeles fantasy. Wealth, beaches, privacy, natural beauty. The Pacific Coast Highway wound through the area, connecting beach communities and providing stunning ocean views. Homes ranged from small beach cottages to massive compounds, depending on location and when they were built. Surfing culture was central to Malibu identity. The waves at Surfrider Beach were world famous, perfect points breaking consistently and offering long rides. Surfers spent entire days in the water, part of a subculture with its own language, values and hierarchy based on skill and respect for wave etiquette. The Malibu lifestyle was aspirational, representing success and escape. But living there had drawbacks: fire danger in the dry hills, mudslides during heavy rains, limited services and restaurants, long commutes to Los Angeles employment centers. The beauty and exclusivity came with trade-offs most people gladly accepted. Pasadena, northeast of downtown Los Angeles, was old money and traditional values. The city maintained its own identity, refusing to be absorbed into Los Angeles proper, despite being surrounded by the sprawling metropolis. The architecture was grand and well-maintained, with beautiful homes from the early 20th century preserved and protected. The Rose Bowl, a stadium built in 1922, hosted the annual Rose Bowl game every New Year's Day, a college football tradition broadcast nationally. The Rose Parade preceding the game featured elaborate floats covered in flowers, marching bands and celebrities, attracting hundreds of thousands of spectators to Pasadena's streets. California Institute of Technology, one of the world's premier science and engineering universities, was located in Pasadena, giving the city an intellectual character alongside its wealth. Caltech graduates would go on to win Nobel Prizes, make fundamental scientific discoveries, and lead major corporations. West Hollywood wouldn't officially become a city until 1984, but the area already had a distinct identity in the 70s. The Strip was its most famous attraction, but West Hollywood was also becoming known as a gay-friendly area, a place where same-sex couples could be open about their relationships without facing the harassment they'd experience in less tolerant neighborhoods. Gay bars and nightclubs operated throughout West Hollywood. Studio One was the premier disco. The Troubadour booked gay performers. Bookstores catering to gay clientele sold literature and magazines that would be suppressed elsewhere. The area provided a rare space of relative safety and acceptance in a decade still deeply homophobic. Downtown Los Angeles in the 70s was in decline, a problem that would only worsen in the 80s before eventually reversing. The office buildings were emptying as companies moved to newer structures on the west side. Retail stores were closing as customers shifted to suburban shopping malls. Skid Row was expanding, homeless populations growing, the area becoming dangerous and uninviting. But downtown still had pockets of vitality. The jewelry district maintained its trade. The flower market operated early morning hours, wholesalers selling to florists and decorators. Olvera Street preserved Los Angeles's Mexican heritage, with shops and restaurants catering to tourists. Grand Central Market offered diverse food vendors in a historic building. Boyle Heights, east of downtown, was predominantly Latino, working-class families living in older housing stock and maintaining strong community bonds. The neighborhood had previously been Jewish, and synagogues built by that earlier community still stood, some converted to churches, others maintained by small congregations. Mariachi Plaza was the heart of Boyle Heights, a place where mariachi musicians gathered to be hired for events and parties. The musicians wore traditional outfits and played traditional instruments, keeping alive a Mexican musical tradition that stretched back centuries. Each neighborhood told a piece of the larger Los Angeles story. The city's diversity meant that someone could live their entire life in one neighborhood, rarely venturing beyond its boundaries, experiencing a version of Los Angeles completely different from someone living 10 miles away. The neighborhoods provided identity, community, and belonging in a vast, sprawling metropolis that could easily feel anonymous and isolating. As the 70s progressed, the neighborhoods evolved. Some improved as investment flowed in. Others deteriorated as residents who could afford to leave did so. The process of change was constant, Los Angeles always becoming something new, never quite finished, never quite stable, always in motion toward an uncertain future. The 70s in Los Angeles were marked by political upheaval and social movements that challenged existing power structures and sought to create a more just and equal society. The decade opened with the Vietnam War still raging and closed with a conservative shift that would define the 80s and beyond. The Vietnam War cast a long shadow over Los Angeles through the early 70s. anti-war protests continued, though they were smaller and less frequent than the massive demonstrations of the late 60s. The Santa Monica Civic Auditorium hosted speakers and rallies. UCLA students organized demonstrations on campus. But momentum was fading, exhaustion setting in after years of protest that hadn't ended the war. American troops withdrew from Vietnam in 1973 following the Paris Peace Accords, ending direct U.S. military involvement. Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces in April 1975, the final humiliating conclusion to America's longest war. Soldiers returned home, many suffering from physical wounds, psychological trauma, and heroin addiction acquired during service. Veterans weren't celebrated upon return as World War II soldiers had been. Many faced hostility or indifference, blamed for a war they hadn't started or wanted. The VA hospitals in Los Angeles treated thousands of wounded veterans, physical injuries and PTSD that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The refugee crisis following Saigon's fall brought Vietnamese, Cambodian and Laotian immigrants to Los Angeles in large numbers. They settled primarily in Orange County, south of Los Angeles, but also established communities within the city. The culture shock was immense, going from war-torn Southeast Asian countries to suburban American life, navigating language barriers and cultural differences while dealing with trauma and loss. The women's liberation movement was transforming gender relations, challenging assumptions that had been accepted for generations. Women demanded equal pay for equal work, access to professions traditionally reserved for men, and control over their own bodies, including reproductive choices. Los Angeles feminist organizations held consciousness-raising groups where women shared experiences and recognized that personal problems were actually political issues requiring collective action. The groups discussed marriage, motherhood, sexuality, work, recognizing patterns of oppression that individual women had thought were unique to them. The fight for legal equality included battles over employment discrimination, credit access, education opportunities, all areas where women face systematic disadvantages. Progress came in increments, each victory requiring sustained effort and generating backlash from those threatened by changes to traditional gender roles. Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision legalizing abortion nationwide, was celebrated by feminists as a landmark victory for women's bodily autonomy. But opposition was immediate and intense, religious conservatives beginning the campaign to overturn the decision that continues to this day. The gay rights movement was gaining strength in Los Angeles as elsewhere, though the progress was slow and hard-won. Homosexuality was still illegal in California until 1975, when the sodomy law was repealed. Police regularly raided gay bars, arresting patrons for minor infractions or no reason at all, harassment designed to intimidate and control. The Metropolitan Community Church, founded in Los Angeles by Reverend Troy Perry in 1968, provided a welcoming religious home for LGBTQ people rejected by traditional churches. The church grew rapidly, demonstrating that many gay and lesbian people wanted spiritual community and were creating their own institutions when existing ones rejected them. Harvey Milk, who had become the first openly gay elected official in California, spent time in Los Angeles before moving to San Francisco. His activism and eventual assassination in 1978 made him a martyr for the movement, his life demonstrating both the possibilities and dangers of being openly gay in politics. West Hollywood's emergence as a gay neighborhood provided a geographic center for LGBTQ community, a place where people could be themselves without hiding their identity. Bookstores, bars, restaurants, theaters, all catering to gay clientele, created an infrastructure of acceptance rare in 1970s America. Chicano rights activism was strong in Los Angeles, building on the farm worker movement led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and extending to urban issues like education, police brutality, and political representation. The Chicano Moratorium anti-war march in August 1970 brought thousands of Mexican Americans to the streets of East Los Angeles, protesting the disproportionate number of Latino soldiers dying in Vietnam. The protest turned violent when police attacked the crowd, beating demonstrators and firing tear gas. Journalist Ruben Salazar, a prominent Chicano journalist for the Los Angeles Times, was killed when a sheriff's deputy fired a tear gas projectile into the bar where Salazar had taken shelter. His death became a rallying point, proof of police brutality and the dangers Chicano activists faced. Chicano studies programs were established at universities, teaching Mexican-American history and culture that had been excluded from traditional curricula. The programs trained a generation of leaders and intellectuals who would advocate for their communities. Bilingual education became a political battleground, advocates arguing that Spanish-speaking children needed instruction in their native language to succeed academically, while opponents claimed bilingual education prevented assimilation and perpetuated language barriers. School busing for racial integration generated fierce controversy in Los Angeles as it did nationwide. The goal was to desegregate schools by transporting students from segregated neighborhoods to schools in other areas, creating more racially mixed student bodies. The program was intended to provide Black and Latino students access to better funded schools, while giving white students exposure to different cultures. But many white parents resisted fiercely, seeing busing as forced social engineering that harmed their children. Some pulled their kids from public schools, enrolling them in private schools or moving to suburbs outside busing program jurisdiction. The result was white flight that left urban schools even more segregated and underfunded than before. Black students bused to predominantly white schools often faced hostility from white students and teachers. They were made to feel unwelcome, tracked into lower-level classes, and disciplined more harshly for the same behavior white students got away with. The program's goals were noble, but implementation was deeply flawed. Environmental activism, sparked by the first Earth Day in April 1970, focused attention on air and water pollution, conservation, and sustainable living. Los Angeles, with its notorious smog problem, became a focal point for clean air activism. The California Air Resources Board established increasingly strict emission standards for vehicles and industrial facilities. Catalytic converters became mandatory equipment on new cars, reducing pollutants from exhaust. Industries were required to install scrubbers and other pollution control equipment. The progress was slow, but real. By the end of the decade, Los Angeles air was noticeably cleaner than it had been in 1970, though it still had a long way to go. The environmental movement had achieved political influence. Environmental impact statements were now required for major projects, and the concept of sustainability was entering public consciousness. Ronald Reagan served as governor of California from 1967 to 1975, his tenure covering much of the 70s. Reagan represented a conservative backlash against the 60s, appealing to voters disturbed by protests, crime, and social change. His political style was folksy and optimistic, delivering conservative messages with a smile and a joke. Reagan's governorship was marked by confrontation with student protesters, welfare reform that critics called punitive, and budget cuts to education and social services. But he was popular with many Californians who appreciated his law and order rhetoric and promises to restore traditional values. After leaving the governorship, Reagan mounted presidential campaigns in 1976 and 1980, the second succeeding. His rise from Hollywood actor to California governor to president demonstrated the power of political conservatism and celebrity culture, a combination that would define Republican politics for decades. Watergate, though centered in Washington, affected Los Angeles as it did the entire country. The scandal involving President Nixon's cover-up of crimes committed by his campaign revealed widespread corruption in government. Nixon resigned in August 1974, the first president to do so, rather than face certain impeachment. The scandal bred cynicism about politics and government that would persist through the 70s and beyond. Trust in institutions declined sharply. People who had believed in the essential goodness of American democracy had to confront evidence of lies, corruption, and abuse of power at the highest levels. The political shifts of the 70s, from liberal activism to conservative reaction, from optimism about social progress to skepticism and exhaustion, shaped Los Angeles and America in ways still felt today. The movements achieved real victories, expanding rights and consciousness, but also triggered backlashes that would roll back some gains and prevent others. Los Angeles was a complicated political landscape, home to both radical activists and conservative establishment figures, to communities demanding change and people defending the status quo. The diversity made politics contentious and fascinating. every issue debated from multiple perspectives, no consensus ever quite achieved. As the decade closed, the political energy was shifting rightward. Proposition 13 passed in 1978, slashed property taxes and made it nearly impossible to raise taxes without supermajority votes. The proposition devastated public services, schools, and libraries, but it reflected voter anger about taxes and government spending that would fuel conservative politics through the 80s. The 70s in Los Angeles were a decade of political ferment, social experimentation, and cultural change. The movements that emerged or strengthened during this period, from women's liberation to gay rights to environmental activism to Chicano empowerment, would continue shaping American society long after the decade ended. The battles fought in 70s, Los Angeles echoed nationwide, part of a larger struggle to define what kind of country America would become. Beyond the major cultural and political movements, 70s Los Angeles was defined by the small details of everyday existence, the fashion choices and fads and ordinary routines that made life in that particular time and place distinctive. These details may seem trivial compared to wars and social movements, but they're what most people actually experienced, the texture of daily living in a vanished era. Fashion evolved rapidly through the decade, reflecting changing tastes and attitudes. The early 70s retained hippie influences, flowing fabrics and natural materials, but gradually gave way to something more streamlined and deliberately stylish. By the late 70s, the transition to 80s fashion was beginning, tighter clothes and more synthetic materials replacing the looser, more organic styles of earlier years. Women's fashion in the early 70s included peasant blouses, often white or cream-coloured with embroidery around the neckline and sleeves. These were paired with long skirts, sometimes floor-length maxi skirts that swept the ground as you walked. The look was romantic and impractical, requiring constant attention to avoid tripping over hems or catching fabric indoors. Hot pants, very short shorts that barely covered the buttocks, were briefly everywhere in the early 70s. Women wore them with knee-high boots or platform shoes, creating an outfit that was simultaneously childish and sexual. The fashion was controversial, some seeing it as liberating while others considered it objectifying, but it persisted for a few years before fading. Jumpsuits, one-piece garments that zipped up the front, offered the convenience of a single item that provided a complete outfit. They came in various fabrics, from denim to disco-appropriate metallic materials, and in styles ranging from casual to formal. The main drawback was bathroom logistics, requiring almost complete undressing. But fashion has always demanded sacrifice. As disco emerged, fashion became more glamorous and revealing. Halter tops that tied behind the neck left backs completely exposed. Tube tops stayed up through faith and elastic. Wrap dresses, popularized by designer Diane von Furstenberg, could be dressed up or down and flattered most body types. Hair was a major commitment and fashion statement. The feathered style popularized by Farrah Fawcett in the mid-70s required skilled blow-drying, creating wings that flipped away from the face. Women practiced for hours with round brushes and hair dryers, trying to achieve the perfect flip. Perms added curl and volume to straight hair. The process involved chemical treatment that broke down hair structure, then reforming it around rollers to create permanent waves. The smell was terrible, the time commitment substantial, and the results didn't always match expectations, but millions of women got perms anyway, because the alternative was spending even more time styling naturally straight hair. The afro, worn by black men and women, was both a fashion statement and a political statement, a celebration of natural black hair and rejection of white beauty standards that demanded straightening and chemical treatments. The style required careful maintenance to achieve the perfect round shape, and specialized picks were used to lift and shape the hair. Men's fashion in the 70s was equally distinctive. Shirts featured wide collars that sometimes extended nearly to the shoulders, pointed lapels that created dramatic silhouettes. The collars were designed to be worn open, showing chest hair and gold chains, a look that projected machismo and sexuality. Leisure suits, those matching jacket and trouser combinations in polyester, became symbols of the decade. They came in every color: tan, baby blue, forest green, burgundy, even white. Men wore them to work, to parties, on dates, believing they looked sophisticated and modern. The suits were comfortable and wrinkle-resistant, practical advantages that contributed to their popularity. Turtlenecks were popular throughout the decade, worn alone or under sport coats. The look was preppy and intellectual, associated with professors and artists. Turtlenecks came in every colour and weight, from thin summer versions to thick winter sweaters. Platform shoes were worn by both men and women, those improbably thick soles adding 3 to 6 inches of height. The shoes came in every imaginable style. Sandals with cork platforms, boots with solid heels, sneakers with wedges. Walking in platforms required balance and practice, and twisted ankles were a common hazard. Fads swept through Los Angeles with remarkable speed. The pet rock, literally a rock sold in a cardboard carrying case as a humorous gift, became a phenomenon in 1975. The creator made millions selling something freely available on any beach or vacant lot. The success said something about American consumer culture and the willingness to buy anything marketed cleverly enough. Mood rings, which change colour supposedly based on the wearer's emotional state, were popular briefly. The colour changes were actually caused by body temperature variations, not emotions. But that didn't stop people from believing the rings had mystical properties. They were cheap and broke easily, which didn't matter because they'd be replaced by the next fad soon enough. CB, radios, originally used by truckers to communicate while driving, became a civilian craze in the mid-70s. People installed radios in their cars and homes, adopting handles, nicknames, and learning CB slang. The appeal was connection, talking to strangers across distances without phone bills. But the novelty wore off, and most CB radios ended up in closets or garage sales. Roller disco combined 2 major 70s phenomena, roller skating and disco music. Rinks like Flippers on La Cienega hosted events where hundreds of people would skate in circles to pulsing beats, the mirrors and lights creating a mobile disco experience. The vibe was less about athletic skating and more about social interaction, seeing and being seen while gliding around the polished floor. Skateboarding evolved from simple cruising to trick-based street skating and pool riding. The Dogtown and Z-Boys, teenagers from the Venice and Santa Monica areas, revolutionized skateboarding by applying surfing moves to concrete, riding empty swimming pools during the drought years when property owners drained them. Their aggressive style and outlaw attitude made skateboarding cool in a way it hadn't been since the 50s. Skate parks began opening, concrete facilities with bowls and ramps designed specifically for skateboarding. The sport was becoming commercialized, professional skaters earning money through endorsements and competitions, but it retained its rebellious edge. Communication in the 70s required patience and planning. Telephones were attached to walls or sitting on tables, connected by cords that limited how far you could move while talking. Long-distance calls were expensive, charged by the minute, so you kept them brief. Calling someone meant hoping they were home when you called, no way to leave a message unless you called back later. Pay phones were everywhere, on street corners, in restaurants, in hotel lobbies, anywhere people might need to make a call while away from home. They cost a dime initially, then a quarter as inflation hit. You'd drop coins in the slot, dial the number, and hope you had enough change if the call lasted longer than expected. Answering machines were starting to appear in some homes by the late 70s, devices that would record messages when nobody answered. They were expensive and seen as slightly pretentious, suggesting you thought you were too important to miss calls. Most people relied on calling back repeatedly until they reached the person. Dating culture in the 70s operated according to conventions that now seem formal and restrictive. Boys asked girls out, initiating contact and making plans. Girls could accept or decline, but weren't supposed to do the asking. A date meant the boy picking up the girl at her house, meeting her parents, then going to a planned activity. Movie, dinner, miniature golf, whatever seemed appropriate. Going steady meant exclusive dating, a relationship status announced by giving your partner your class ring or wearing matching jewelry. Breaking up required returning these items, a ritual that formalized the end of the relationship. Singles bars were where adults looking for romance or casual sex would congregate. The bars had deliberately dim lighting, loud music to encourage shouting conversations that forced physical closeness, and alcohol to lower inhibitions. People would circle the room, making eye contact, approaching attractive strangers with pickup lines ranging from clever to cringe-inducing. Personal ads in the back of newspapers offered another option for meeting potential partners. People would write brief descriptions of themselves and what they sought. Something like SWM, 30s, professional seeks SWF for dining and dancing, possible relationship. Interested parties would respond by mail, beginning correspondences that might lead to dates. Grocery shopping in the 70s was a different experience than today. Supermarkets were smaller and carried fewer products. The produce sections offered basics: iceberg lettuce, tomatoes, carrots, potatoes, apples, oranges, bananas. Exotic fruits like kiwis or mangoes were rarely available. Organic wasn't a category most stores recognised. Packaged foods dominated the aisles, convenience being a major selling point. TV dinners in aluminum trays could be heated in the oven, providing a complete meal with no preparation. Frozen vegetables, canned goods, boxed mixes for cakes and pasta dishes all promised to make cooking easier. Health food stores were separate entities, usually smaller shops that carried whole grains, nutritional supplements, vegetarian products, and organic produce when available. The clientele was younger and more countercultural, people who rejected mainstream American food culture. Gas stations were full service in many cases, attendants pumping your gas, checking your oil, and cleaning your windshield while you sat in the car. Self-service was starting to appear, offering lower prices for customers willing to pump their own gas. But many people preferred the convenience of full service. The 1973 oil crisis created gas lines that stretched for blocks, sometimes hours of waiting to fill your tank. The experience was frustrating and anxiety-inducing, not knowing if the station would run out before you reached the pump. People changed their driving habits, consolidating trips and driving less to conserve fuel. Children's entertainment in the 70s was simpler than today's overstimulated media environment. Saturday morning cartoons were a ritual, kids waking early to watch Scooby-Doo, Looney Tunes, Super Friends, and other animated shows. The programming was designed to sell toys and sugary cereal. Commercials integrated seamlessly into content designed to create demand. Board games provided family entertainment. Monopoly, Scrabble, Clue. These classics were played around dining room tables, multiple generations competing and bonding. The games required patience and face-to-face interaction, skills that would erode as electronic entertainment proliferated. Toys were often simple by modern standards. Matchbox cars, small metal vehicles that kids would race and crash and collect. Barbies and other fashion dolls that came with extensive wardrobes and accessories. Sports equipment, balls and bats and bikes, things that encouraged physical activity rather than sedentary screen time. The everyday rhythms of 70s Los Angeles, the fashion and fads and routines that structured daily existence, created a texture fundamentally different from contemporary life. The pace was slower, less mediated by technology, more dependent on physical presence and direct interaction. People lived in the moment, because recording and sharing moments wasn't possible. Life happened and then it was over, preserved in memory and perhaps a few photographs kept in albums, rather than digital clouds. These everyday details are easy to dismiss as trivial, but they shaped experience profoundly. The world you live in, the tools and technologies you use, the social conventions that govern behavior, all influence how you understand yourself and others. 70s. Los Angeles was a different world, recent enough to seem familiar, but distant enough to feel foreign. Understanding the everyday details helps capture that vanished time, making it vivid and real rather than just historical abstraction. If you had to choose one year that captured 70s Los Angeles at its creative and cultural peak, 1974 would be the obvious selection. Everything that made the decade special seemed to converge during those 12 months. Multiple trends reaching maturity simultaneously. Artistic ambition and commercial success briefly aligned. The film industry was in the middle of its most creatively fertile period. Chinatown premiered in June, Roman Polanski's neo-noir masterpiece that used Los Angeles history and geography as essential story elements. The film wasn't just set in Los Angeles. It was about Los Angeles, exploring the water politics that allowed the city to grow beyond natural limits, the corruption that enabled certain people to profit from civic infrastructure, the way power operated behind the scenes. Jack Nicholson's performance as private detective Jake Gittys created one of cinema's great characters, a man trying to do right in a world that punished righteousness and rewarded cynicism. Faye Dunaway was equally brilliant as a woman harbouring terrible secrets. John Huston played the villain with chilling conviction. Robert Towne's screenplay is still taught in film schools as near-perfect structure and dialogue. The Godfather Part 2 was released in December, Francis Ford Coppola's ambitious sequel that expanded and complicated the first film's story. The parallel narratives, one following Michael Corleone's consolidation of power in the late 1950s, the other depicting his father Vito's rise in early 20th century New York, created a complex meditation on family, power, and the corruption of the American dream. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture, one of the rare sequels to achieve that honour. Coppola's artistic vision had been vindicated, proving that commercially successful films could also be artistically ambitious, that audiences would embrace complexity and depth if you trusted them enough to deliver it. The Conversation, also directed by Coppola and released earlier in 1974, was a paranoid thriller about surveillance and privacy that felt prescient given recent Watergate revelations. Gene Hackman played a surveillance expert who becomes entangled in a dangerous conspiracy. The film's themes about technology, privacy, and moral responsibility resonate even more today than they did in 1974. Other significant films released in 1974 included Young Frankenstein, Mel Brooks' loving parody of classic horror films, Blazing Saddles, Brooks' anarchic Western comedy that satirized racism and genre conventions, The Towering Inferno, a disaster film representing that genre at its peak, and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Martin Scorsese's sympathetic portrait of a working-class woman struggling to survive and maintain her dignity. The range of films being released, from intimate character studies to massive spectacles, from comedy to drama to action, demonstrated what American cinema could achieve when directors had freedom and studios were willing to take risks. Not every film was a masterpiece, but almost everything was interesting, trying something, pushing boundaries in some direction. Music in 1974 was equally varied and vibrant. Steely Dan released Pretzel Logic, their third album, showcasing their sophisticated jazz rock fusion and cryptic, literate lyrics. The Doobie Brothers were at their commercial peak. Joni Mitchell released Court and Spark, her most accessible and commercially successful album. Eric Clapton's 461 Ocean Boulevard included I Shot the Sheriff, a reggae cover that introduced many white audiences to Bob Marley's songwriting. Disco was emerging as a major force. MFSB's TSOP, The Sound of Philadelphia, topped the charts. George McRae's Rock Your Baby was a massive hit. The genre was transitioning from underground club culture to mainstream phenomenon, a process that would accelerate over the next few years. Television production in Los Angeles was thriving. Happy Days premiered in January, a nostalgic sitcom about 1950s America that became a huge hit by offering simple, wholesome entertainment that contrasted sharply with the complex social realities of the 70s. Little House on the Prairie started in September, another wholesome family drama that offered escape into a simpler past. More adventurous programming included The Rockford Files, a detective show starring James Garner that was filmed around Los Angeles and featured the city as a character. The show was smart and funny, avoiding some of the formulaic elements that plagued other crime dramas. The political landscape in 1974 was dominated by Watergate and its aftermath. Richard Nixon resigned in August, the first president to do so, rather than face certain impeachment and conviction. The scandal had been unfolding for 2 years, each new revelation making the corruption more apparent. For Los Angeles, which had been Nixon's home before he entered politics, the resignation was personally embarrassing. Nixon had attended Whittier College and practiced law in the area. His political career had launched from California. Now he was disgraced, leaving the White House in a helicopter, while staff wept and protesters celebrated. Gerald Ford became president without ever having been elected president or vice president, appointed to replace the disgraced Spiro Agnew, then elevated when Nixon resigned. Ford's pardon of Nixon, granted in September, was controversial and probably cost him the 1976 election. Many Americans wanted Nixon prosecuted, seeing the pardon as another example of powerful people escaping consequences for their actions. The economy in 1974 was starting to show strain. Inflation was increasing, driven partly by oil prices that had spiked during the 1973 crisis and never fully retreated. Unemployment was rising. The post-war economic boom that had created American prosperity was ending, though most people didn't realize it yet. But for Los Angeles, 1974 was still a moment of cultural confidence. The city was producing the movies and music and television that defined American popular culture. Creative people flocked to Los Angeles, believing it was where things happened, where careers were made, where the future was being created. Sports provided civic pride. The Los Angeles Lakers, though not championship level, featured Jerry West in the final years of his career. The Dodgers were competitive, attracting huge crowds to Dodger Stadium. USC football remained a powerhouse under coach John McKay, who would leave for the NFL after the 1974 season. The weather in 1974 was typically beautiful, reinforcing the image of Los Angeles as paradise. Sunshine most days, temperatures mild, rarely too hot or too cold, the kind of climate that made outdoor living possible year-round. The smog was still problematic, but regulations were starting to improve air quality, progress visible to anyone who'd lived in the city for years. The fashion in 1974 captured the mid-decade aesthetic. Bell-bottoms and platforms, bright colours and bold patterns, hair feathered and styled, makeup dramatic. People dressed to be noticed, to express themselves, to participate in the visual spectacle of Los Angeles street life. Looking back, 1974 represents a peak moment, the brief period when everything aligned, when artistic ambition and commercial success weren't seen as contradictory, when Los Angeles was creating culture that mattered and would endure. The moment wouldn't last. Nothing good ever does. But for that year, Los Angeles was exactly what it claimed to be, the entertainment capital of the world, the place where dreams came true, the city of the future. And for once, the claim was accurate. The late 1970s in Los Angeles saw the gradual tarnishing of the decade's early promise. The city that had seemed to embody possibility and reinvention was revealing its limitations, its problems, its inability to fully deliver on the dreams it sold. The economy was struggling by the late 70s. Inflation was high, sometimes exceeding 10% annually, eroding purchasing power and creating anxiety about the future. Unemployment rose, particularly in industries like aerospace that had driven Los Angeles' prosperity. The oil crises had demonstrated American vulnerability, the country unable to control its own economic destiny. Crime continued increasing. Gang violence was becoming more lethal as guns proliferated and drug markets expanded. The Hillside Strangler terrorized Los Angeles in 1977 and 1978. Women afraid to go out alone, the sense of safety that even dangerous cities maintain, eroding into genuine fear. Urban decay was visible in many neighborhoods. Downtown Los Angeles was hollowing out, businesses fleeing to the suburbs, leaving behind empty buildings and expanding homeless populations. South Central was deteriorating under the weight of poverty, unemployment, and gang violence. Even relatively prosperous areas showed signs of wear, infrastructure aging without adequate maintenance, public services cut as tax revenue declined. The Sunset Strip was losing some of its magic. Commercialization was increasing, corporations recognizing the area's value and moving in with chain restaurants and retail. The independent clubs that had made the Strip vital were struggling. Some were closing, unable to compete with larger venues or pay rising rents. The spontaneous creativity of earlier years was giving way to more calculated commercial entertainment. Disco was facing a racist, homophobic backlash disguised as musical taste criticism. Rock fans declared disco sucks, organizing protests and record burnings, attacking a genre associated with gay culture and Black and Latino artists. The backlash peaked with Disco Demolition Night in Chicago in July 1979, when disco records were blown up and the crowd turned violent, forcing cancellation of a baseball game. Punk rock was expressing nihilism and anger that reflected the decade's darkening mood. The early punk energy was curdling into something more destructive, violence at shows increasing, the scene attracting people more interested in fighting than music. Darby Crash of the Germs exemplified the self-destructive trajectory, his performances growing more chaotic, his drug use more severe, leading eventually to his death from intentional heroin overdose in December 1980. Hollywood was shifting toward the blockbuster model that would dominate the 80s. After the success of Jaws and Star Wars, studios wanted repeatable formulas, franchises, merchandising opportunities. The artistic freedom directors had enjoyed in the early 70s was being curtailed. Studios wanted safer investments, proven concepts, movies that could be marketed easily to mass audiences. The auteur era was ending, even as some of its greatest works were still being released. Directors who had been given free rein were now facing more interference, their projects scrutinized by executives and test audiences, compromises forced in the name of commercial viability. Some directors like Scorsese and Coppola would continue making important films, but they'd have to fight for every project, justify every decision, prove themselves repeatedly. The Iranian hostage crisis, beginning in November 1979 when Iranian revolutionaries seized the American embassy in Tehran, created a sense of national impotence and frustration. 52 Americans were held for 404 days, daily television coverage reminding everyone of America's inability to rescue them or force their release. The crisis contributed to a mood of malaise, a feeling that American power and confidence were waning. President Jimmy Carter addressed the national mood in a famous speech in July 1979, never actually using the word malaise, but diagnosing a crisis of confidence, Americans losing faith in their institutions and their future. The speech was honest and probably accurate, but honesty wasn't what people wanted to hear. They wanted optimism and reassurance, which Carter couldn't convincingly provide. Los Angeles was entering a period that would be even more difficult. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s would make the 70s drug problems seem mild by comparison. Gang violence would increase dramatically. The 1992 riots would devastate South Central. Economic inequality would widen further. The problems visible in the late 70s were just beginning. But the city would also demonstrate resilience. Los Angeles always survives, always adapts, always finds a way forward. The neighborhoods would rebuild. Immigrants would continue arriving. The entertainment industry would remain vital, and the sunshine would keep shining, indifferent to human problems. The decade ended with a sense of transition, the 70s giving way to something unknown. The idealism of the early 70s, which had been a hangover from the 60s, was finally exhausted. The greed and excess of the 80s were beginning to emerge. Los Angeles was between eras, mourning what was ending while not yet understanding what was coming. What had been gained? The music, films, and television of 70s Los Angeles left a lasting legacy, work that still resonates decades later. The social movements achieved real progress, expanding rights and opportunities, changing consciousness in ways that couldn't be completely reversed. The city had proven its cultural importance, establishing itself as more than just Hollywood, becoming a genuine creative capital. What had been lost? The sense of possibility, the belief that radical change was achievable, the optimism about human nature and social progress, all eroded during the decade. The crime, violence, and corruption demonstrated that Los Angeles was fundamentally a city like any other, subject to the same problems and failures despite its sunshine and glamour. The 1970s in Los Angeles were contradictory, complicated, impossible to reduce to simple narratives. The decade was beautiful and ugly, creative and destructive, liberating and confining, optimistic and despairing. All of these contradictions coexisted, creating a rich, complex, fascinating period that shaped everything that followed. For those who lived through it, the 70s remain vivid in memory, a time when everything seemed heightened and intense, when culture was being created in real time, when the rules were being rewritten, and nobody knew what would happen next. The nostalgia for the decade is understandable, even if it glosses over the problems and pain. Los Angeles in the 70s was a moment, a brief window when the city was writing the script for modern American culture without fully realizing what it was doing. The work produced during those years, the music and movies and art, achieved a level of excellence and influence that's difficult to match. The social experiments, both successful and failed, provided lessons about community, identity, and human possibility. As the decade ended and the 80s began, Los Angeles was preparing for transformation. The city would change profoundly over the next decades, becoming more diverse, more expensive, more divided, more global. But the foundation laid in the 70s, the cultural infrastructure and creative ambition, would persist, shaping Los Angeles even as it evolved. The dream didn't die completely. It just became more complicated, more aware of its limitations, more realistic about what was possible. And perhaps that's the real legacy of 1970s Los Angeles. The lesson that dreams need to be grounded in reality, that paradise always comes with problems, and that the work of building a better world is never finished, just passed from one generation to the next. The sun is setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the same colours that have ended days here for thousands of years, long before any city existed. The light catches the smog particles that still hang in the air despite decades of regulation, creating the famous Los Angeles glow that photographers chase and locals barely notice anymore. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote is beginning its nightly hunt. Down on Sunset Boulevard, the neon signs are flickering to life, the street beginning its transformation from ordinary to electric. In South Central, families are finishing dinner, children doing homework, parents working second jobs to make ends meet. On the beaches, the last surfers are catching final waves before darkness makes it impossible to see the sets rolling in. Los Angeles in the 70s was all of this. The beauty and the struggle, the dreams and the disappointments, the creativity and the crime. It was a city in flux, always becoming, never quite arriving. The decade that began with shock and mourning ended with exhaustion and uncertainty. But between those bookends, something remarkable happened. The city produced art that mattered, music that still resonates, films that are still studied and loved. The social movements that gained strength during these years expanded consciousness and opportunity, making America gradually more just and equal, despite fierce resistance. The risks taken by artists, activists, and ordinary people trying to live with integrity and purpose created a legacy that extended far beyond the decade itself. For everyone who was there, who lived through those years in Los Angeles, the memories remain vivid even as details fade. The specific clubs you went to, the concerts you saw, the neighborhoods you lived in, the people you loved and lost, all of it shaped who you became. And for those who came later, who only know the 70s through stories and photographs and the cultural products that survived, understanding this era provides context for everything that followed. Los Angeles today is profoundly different from the city of the 70s, transformed by decades of change, new waves of immigration, technological revolution, economic restructuring. The clubs that define the Sunset Strip are mostly gone, replaced or radically altered. The neighborhoods have gentrified or declined, their demographics and characters shifted. The people who made the 70s vital have aged, retired, moved away, or died. But something essential persists. Los Angeles remains a place where people come to reinvent themselves, to pursue dreams that seem impossible anywhere else, to create culture that shapes how the world sees itself. The specific forms change, the industries evolve, the populations shift, but the fundamental character of the city, its essential ambition and optimism, mixed with darkness and danger, continues. The 1970s were a particular moment in that ongoing story. A decade when Los Angeles's influence peaked in certain ways, when the city was writing the rulebook for American popular culture, when what happened in Los Angeles clubs and studios and streets mattered to people across the country and around the world. That moment has passed, but its influence remains, woven into the fabric of contemporary life in ways we often don't recognize. If you enjoyed this journey through 1970s Los Angeles, please consider liking and subscribing to this channel. We explore history like this regularly, diving deep into the details that bring vanished worlds to life, helping you understand how we got from there to here. Your support helps us continue creating these documentaries, preserving memories, and understanding context that might otherwise be lost. Thank you for spending this time with me, traveling back to a Los Angeles that no longer exists, except in memory and artifacts. May you sleep peacefully, dreaming perhaps of neon lights and canyon nights, of music and magic, of a city that promised everything and delivered something more complicated and ultimately more interesting than any simple fantasy could provide. Good night, and may your dreams take you wherever you need to go.